remind everyone to please close their cell phones. I have just done myself a good example. Success. Okay. It is a rare pleasure to partake of a conference where researchers and practitioners consider together a major area of Jewish education. It is a fairly rare occurrence and one of great importance, and therefore I want to commend the organizers of this conference for getting us together. It is a particular pleasure to introduce Professor Ellen Goldring. Our association, Ellen, goes back, I think, 15, 16 years, when Ellen agreed to join a series of studies for the Mandel Foundation in the wake of the work of the Commission for Jewish Education in North America. In a field almost bereft of systematic empirical study, we owe to you and to your colleagues a study of teachers, a first study, I think, of teachers in Jewish schools in 3 communities, which is to this day a standard for anyone attempting to look at teachers in Jewish school and continuing to study the field. Teachers, their preparation, their retention, and more. You help clarify the acute shortage of teacher preparation. Since then, you have contributed to major endeavors in Jewish institutions in various ways. The field of Jewish education needs to be enriched by general education and theories in general education in the way that you demonstrate time and again, and we will return to this hopefully following your lecture. Professor Ellen Goldring holds a PhD in education from the University of Chicago and a master's degree from Tel Aviv University. Since 1994, she is professor in the Department of Leadership, Policy and Organization at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. From 1994 to 98, Ellen was Associate Dean for Academic Affairs of Vanderbilt's Peabody College. Her research program focuses on improving schools with particular attention to educational leadership and access and equity in schools of choice. Currently, Ellen serves, among others, co-editor of Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, a journal who, for planners and others like me, is basic staple. In Jewish education, besides the studies for the Mandel Foundation and the CIJE, studies of educators and of not so successful attempts at educational change in communities, she has published in such journals as Journal of Jewish Education and Religious Education. We look forward very much to hearing your lecture, Ellen, but I would like to introduce, in the interest of time, the 2 respondents to your lecture. We have the good fortune of having at this session two respondents for whom schools and community have been a major concern and a major area of practice. Professor Chaim Adler is the most recent recipient of the Israel Prize in the Study of Education. As a sociologist of education, he distinguished himself in the way he helped Israel and the Israeli educational systems understand youth and community. He did so by studying youth in formal and informal frameworks, disadvantaged youth, youth at risk, immigrant youth, the integration of immigrant youth into society, and much more. Professor Adler holds a PhD in sociology from the Hebrew University, where he taught from 1966 to 1996 in an academic career that included visiting professorships at Harvard, Chicago, and Stanford, among others. Professor Adler headed Hebrew University's all-important Research Institute for Innovation in Education from 1970 to 1992. He was head of education at the Mandel School for Educational Leadership and, until today, advises the school's graduates as they face challenges in the field. Our third speaker is also close to practice. Shimon Parizhsky is a 2002 graduate of the Jerusalem Fellows Program, and I see several more fellows in the room, which is nice, kind of getting together. He hails from St. Petersburg, where he is assistant professor at Petersburg's Jewish University since 1996. He has taught medieval Hebrew poetry at Vilnius State University, and since 1998 also holds the important position of JDC Coordinator of Educational Programs in St. Petersburg. Shimon has worked extensively on medieval Jewish poetics, studying Ibn Ezra, among others. He has written and is still writing a series of teachers' manuals on the history of Jewish literature in Russian, and has been an innovator in his community, where he makes major contributions to the development of teacher training for Jewish schools. Now back to our keynote speaker, Professor Ellen Goldring, please.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here, and I want to thank Alan Thompson and the organizing committee. But also, I'm so honored because I'm sitting here with some of my teachers, Professor Chaim Adler. I think you were probably one of the first professors I met when I was a young student at Tel Aviv University, learning the ropes and trying to understand Israeli educational system and Israeli education policy, and also to have Annette sit next to me at this table, both a friend, a colleague, and a mentor. As I entered the field of Jewish education, I think I really owe that to Annette and Professor Seymour Fox sitting in the back. We are here to think about the relationship between Jewish day schools and their communities. Others before us have invested in this very topic as well. In 1990, the Commission on Jewish Education in North America concluded that, and I quote, "The system of Jewish education is plagued by many problems. And because of its inadequacies, it is failing to engage the minds of a critical segment of the Jewish population who have no other way of experiencing the beauty and the richness of Jewish life." The Commission then went on to suggest the strategies to address this crisis of major proportions, that it rests with two building blocks, one of which is mobilizing the community's support to meet the needs and goals of Jewish education. We learned from this report a bit about what the Commission had in mind when they used the term community support or community mobilization. They talked about recruiting top community leaders to the cause of Jewish education, raising Jewish education to the top of the communal agenda, creating a positive environment for Jewish education, and providing substantially increased funding from Federation, private family foundations, and other sources. And many in this room probably remember that quote. However, it is somewhat ironic that the Commission viewed the community as both part of the problem as well as the solution to the crisis in Jewish education. The committee report acknowledged that, and I quote, "The Jewish community has not yet recognized the indispensable role it must play. They lack understanding, and they are not sufficiently supportive of the massive investment required to bring about systemic change." What strikes me when rereading this perspective from over a decade ago is the extent to which the stance was taken that the community needs to support the school, and that the school is portrayed as not having much of a role in redefining the nature of collaboration between the school and the community. Today, I want to focus on the role of the school in redefining collaboration and the community. I argue that it is important to explore the purposes and mechanisms of school-community collaboration. In other words, why pursue community collaboration? And what are the mechanisms by which schools and communities can interact and mutually support one another? Thus, today I want to focus on three purposes and corresponding mechanisms or perspectives on why and how communities and schools can work together. A few comments by way of background. Clearly addressing the topic of community in general, and as it relates to Jewish day schools in particular, is very complex. What do we mean by community? What did the Commission mean in using the term community? Who is the community of a Jewish day school? Those parents who send their children to school? the largest community of all Jews, all denominations, those who are associated with the day school who have no other association with the Jewish community, or just formal Jewish institutions of the Jewish day school's locale. For clarity today, I will use the following definition of community. I'm clicking and you're not telling me that we're not going anywhere. I'm sorry. There we go. If we don't go anywhere, you need to tell me because I don't have a screen. For clarity today, I will use the following definition of community by Amitai Etzioni, a noted Israeli sociologist who currently teaches at George Washington University. He uses the following definition. Communities are webs of social relations that encompass shared meanings and, above all, shared values. Again, communities are webs of social relations that encompass shared meanings and, above all, shared values. You'll note the lack of articulation regarding structure in this definition. I chose this definition because we're speaking about Jewish day schools, and these communities tend not to be bound by geography, that is a neighborhood, but are most likely bound together by institution affiliations that help maintain social norms. In this definition, it is clear that individuals are most likely members in a pluralistic web of communities. People are, at one and the same time, members of several communities: work, professional, residential, religious, and others. In this sense, communities are nested. I note that the nature of these overlapping and nested communities will vary greatly by the context of the Jewish locale, such as size. In small Jewish communities, the extent of the overlapping may be very large, while in larger locales, this may not be as much the case. 2, background. As will be increasingly evident, I view the relationship between schools and communities as reciprocal, two-way. Schools impact communities, and communities impact schools. I would venture to say that from my observations, much of Jewish education seems to have a more school-centric view of the relationship between schools and communities. Communities should support schools for sure. However, schools have a very central role in developing their communities as well. And I will return to this point throughout my talk this morning. In this paper, I will focus on 3 strands to help us think through linking schools to communities. I'm not going to talk about parental involvement. I'm not going to talk about resource support, engaging a lay board, communicating, and so on. Sorry, Josh. The first strand I will consider is a focus on school-community collaboration for the purpose of enhancing learning. This perspective emerges from learning theory. In other words, I claim that linking schools to communities is important because it will enhance learning, and I include the development of Jewish identity as part of learning. Second, I will discuss school-community collaboration for the purpose of developing social capital. In this perspective, I suggest that school-community collaboration develops shared norms and relationships of social trust that enhance the development of learning and Jewish identity. Third, I present the notion of school-community collaboration for the purpose of building and developing the wider Jewish community. Here I claim that Jewish day schools should be the engine of community-wide development and support. Again, I feel these 3 perspectives are needed to reignite the focus of school-community collaboration to the core mission of Jewish education, teaching and learning, rather than a focus on the structural arrangements and supports that Jewish schools need for the larger community. In overarching terms, following the lead of Dr. Jonathan Wucher, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Education Service of North America, in my talk today, my goal is to think about Jewish day schools as a way to make our Jewish community more community-like, more effective in providing a social, experiential, cognitive reality that will attract engagement and build commitment. There is a widespread belief held by both educators and non-educators alike that school improvement and student learning must include parent and community involvement. Educators have long argued that schools alone often lack the capacity to address the multiple goals of education, as well as the social problems facing students in today's schools. However, recent theories of social cognition and situated instruction suggest that communities can be much more integrally linked to the core mission of schooling, teaching, and learning. When reviewing typical perspectives on linking schools and communities, most notably the focus on parental involvement or providing resources to schools, we often hear this school-centric point of view. Such a school-centric frame assumes that schools are the primary influence for learning in the lives of children and youth, rather than one part of students' broader developmental context. Thus, the community is so important. Despite a decade of reform, experimentation, and research on the relationships among parents, families, communities, and schools, the empirical knowledge base is still limited and characterized by this school-centric view. Much of the research is narrow. It focuses on school-community relations and on parents' roles in supporting schools, such as helping with homework. Accompanying this line of inquiry is a body of research on the principal that has examined how principals facilitate home-school relationships, negotiate the politics of the community, and relationships with the board to buffer teachers in the academic teaching core. This focus remains inward on the school rather than outward on the community. Principals view their role as garnering resources from the community or managing a delicate balance by buffering and bridging with parents and the board. Clearly, principals primarily view their roles as leaders inside the schools, rather than developing outward towards the community. Contemporary research suggests fresh perspectives that radically realign our views of schools and communities and carry with them new imperatives for understanding effective leadership. I turn now to a discussion of each of the three perspectives or strands: situated cognition, social capital, and community development. For each of these strands, I will first provide a brief example, then I will present information about this perspective or strand, and I will end each by asking emerging questions that have implications for understanding ways in which Jewish day schools can both develop and inhibit community. And I would like to leave you today with the question: can Jewish day schools meet the challenge? Can Jewish day schools meet the challenge raised by these conceptions of school-community collaborations? You will note that I take an extremely optimistic, positive view and believe that turf, politics, and money should not stand in the way of reaping the benefits of school-community collaborations. I turn now to the first perspective, the new science of learning and school community. And I start with an example. High schools today are doing a project on Jewish medical ethics. Rather than having students do research, use text, and write a paper, the high school Jewish medical ethics project design includes specifications that require students to engage with the larger community. The goal of the project is to help students understand how questions of Jewish medical ethics are played out in practice in the community. The teacher invites Jewish physicians into the class and asks them to pose real ethical dilemmas they face to the students, such as, what is the status of the family of a deceased person in respect to consenting or refusing to donate organs? Or, in a multiple pregnancy in which the chances of fetal survival are extremely small without embryo reduction, is it permissible to decrease their number in order to increase the chances of survival of the remaining fetuses? The students then do research in the conventional way, but also confer with Jewish community leaders, such as rabbis from various denominations in the community, as part of their research. They interact with community members who have confronted questions of medical ethics as members of the local Jewish community. And they discuss these issues with practicing physicians, both Jewish and non-Jewish, to gain a comparative perspective. They then make a presentation of their findings to an authentic audience. That is not only teachers and students from their classes, but they invite physicians and community members to hear their conclusions and to receive feedback. Then the students teach others in the community about confronting Jewish medical ethical dilemmas. Connections to experts outside of school can have a positive influence on in-school learning because they provide opportunities for students to interact with other people who take an interest in what students are doing. Sharing in the process of learning together creates a sense of community. This is a real example of a high school doing a class where they are out in the community learning. It highlights the connections between schools and their community as joint contexts for learning in terms of providing real, authentic problems. There are links to expertise in the community, rabbis and physicians, while the learning includes the community because the community comes in to hear the conclusions. These images of learning are not new. In many respects, they echo the work of John Dewey over a century ago, which connected learning with the social and physical environment of the child. But while Dewey's views on learning rested on a philosophical conception of understanding and experience, this recent work has developed from empirical inquiry. A recent National Research Council report called How People Learn provides a concise overview of this new science of learning. This work presents a vivid portrait in the ways in which schools must be envisioned, and I will summarize these new theories of cognition. But before I do, I want to highlight why learning in community is so important. Because as the slide indicates, that if we consider that students spend only about 14% of their time during a typical school year in school, then learning in community becomes even more important. Only 14% of their time is in school. What does the new science of learning tell us? First, perhaps the most central tenet of the new science of learning is that all new knowledge is scaffolded onto pre-existing knowledge. New knowledge comes scaffolded from what we already know. Building on earlier work of cognitive sciences such as Piaget and Vygotsky, noted learning scientist John Bransford and his college indicate that the contemporary view of learning is that people construct new knowledge and understanding based on what they already know and believe. This means that teachers need to pay attention to the incomplete understandings, the false beliefs, and the naive renditions of concepts that learners bring with them to a given subject. A student doesn't come into the classroom not knowing anything. So how do we connect what they already know to what we want them to know? The lion's share of pre-existing knowledge learners bring to school is likely to be shaped by the home and community context in which they find themselves. Active inquiry on the part of teachers is one way of making the connection between what students already know and what they need to know. Even more important is encouraging students to develop the kind of metacognitive skills, thinking about their thinking, helping students think about what it is they're learning and how they're learning. 2, a second critical premise is that learning can be transferred from the context in which it is learned to other relevant settings. And you know that all the time. You're not teaching prayer in Jewish day school so they learn how to pray just in school. We want transfer to multiple settings. Context helps us to provide both the conceptual framework and the organizing structures that enable the learner to bring the understandings and competency gained into a new cognitive venue. Learning may be organized around general principles, for example. It is particularly important, then, that subjects be taught across multiple contexts, with the kinds of examples that demonstrate wide application and which encourage a flexible representation of knowledge. School and community connections that support transfer of learning must link that learning to the real-world context in which the knowledge must be used. Understanding some of the key differences between school and non-school settings is important in constructing optimum learning environments, which are likely to encourage transfer, especially those that emphasize problem-based learning. This means understanding the non-school environments in which children learn. Dewey's insight suggests the school must represent life, life as real invited to the child, as that which he carries on in the home and in the neighborhood or in the playground, capturing the critical nature of this connection. And 3, communities as the context of learning. Finally, the third most important tenet of the new science of learning is that our understandings of schools and communities is the importance of community itself. Community-centered approach to learning is where the classroom and the outside world supports core learning values. Teachers must help students to form the kinds of learning communities where they both give and receive assistance in solving problems. We saw that in our example. Similarly, teachers themselves must be connected in learning communities that focus on developing expertise in pedagogy and curriculum. Equally critical, however, is the imperative to use the broader community as a source of context and experience and learning. Communities not only provide the structures that facilitate learning, they also shape and determine what learning is valued. Now I'm going to play for you a little video clip, which is a story. And I hope it brings to reality what happens when we don't take into account learning, the community, the idea that prior knowledge inhibits the learning of current knowledge, and the importance of linking learning to context.
It has been argued that a children's story written by Nº2 is a key for understanding human learning and how to enhance it. The story is called Fish is Fish. I'm going to summarize it and then ask if you agree or disagree with the argument that it's a key to understanding learning. And I will ask you to provide reasons for the answer you give. Here's the essence of Leone's story. A tadpole and a baby fish live in the same pond. They are intensely curious about the world outside their pond, but they are unable to explore since neither of them can get around or even survive outside of the water. They can only imagine what this new world might be like. Eventually, the tadpole grows into a frog and discovers to her delight that she can leave the pond and see for herself what only her imagination could see before. She promises Fish that she will return soon and tell him everything she saw. After a time, Frog did indeed return. "It's a wondrous place," Frog says, barely able to contain herself. "There are things called birds, and they have wings and beaks, and they can fly. And there are things called cows, and they have 4 feet and udders, and they chew grass. And some of them even have horns. And then there were these things called people, and they have 2 arms and 2 legs, and they walk upright, and they come in all different sizes." Meanwhile, Fish is thinking to himself, "At last I know what the rest of the world is like." And in his mind he pictures a fish bird, only with wings and a beak, and soaring through the air. And then he pictures a fish cow, only with 4 feet, and an udder and horns. And finally he pictures fish people, only in all sizes, and with arms and legs, and walking all around the land. There is more to Leone's story, but this is the part that's relevant to the challenge. What implications do you think it might have for understanding human learning? Or does it have any implications for learning? Please give reasons for the answers you suggest.
Can we have perhaps one thought? What does Fish is Fish thinking have to do with community and Jewish learning for teaching? Yes?
You build on pre-existing knowledge and you build on what you knew about the science of fish as in the human.
Does anyone have an anecdote of that from a teaching experience? Or one that you could imagine if we're just teaching children in classrooms, not taking into account what happens? Yes?
I remember teaching ancient history at one time and going all through this, the entire class talking about this young boy. This was a 5th grade class in ancient history. And then they wrote papers. At the end of the paper, they said, "But then the boy got on an airplane and came back."
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you. Excellent. So what does the perspective on the new theory of learning, what questions does it raise, at least for me, for the relationship between Jewish day schools and communities? Well, obviously, the first one is, how can Jewish day schools better understand the out-of-school context of their students and families to truly enhance learning? How can teachers and leaders take into account the fish is fish phenomena with their students? I know that these are probably very difficult questions to answer, and it is unclear how and where these conversations, both in schools and between schools and communities, take place. Another issue. If real-world contexts are critical to learning, how do schools and school leaders extend the context of learning to include the community, and vice versa? School and community connections must be construed together. In the public school sector, we have such things as integrated services programs. We have after-school programs, community centers. It's not clear to me in the Jewish school arena where these connections occur. At times, we see that Jewish youth groups in their activities are opportunities to learn that support and enter time with Jewish day schools, but what happens to students who are members of different Jewish youth groups and those that are not members of all? Similarly, do teachers take into account the other Jewish educational experiences that their students are undergoing? Currently, it seems to me that these ties are ad hoc and haphazard, based on peer networks of individuals or groups of individuals. In order to institutionalize these funds of knowledge, as we call them, and experiences the students and their families engage in, it is a question about how these ties get formed. We must keep the focus here on teaching and learning. Teachers can extend the space and time for teaching into the community using the access of funds of knowledge about their students provided by connections with communities and families, the involvement of community partners in teaching who also provide resources connected to real-world contexts, and the opportunities for teachers as well as students to create expanded professional networks and supports. Second question. If we believe that communities of learners are vital contexts for learning, how broadly do we envision the community that defines and values that learning? Who's in this community? Who isn't? Schools frequently discount the out-of-school peer and organizational communities that shape students' understandings and provide skills useful in school. We must ask, what are the external communities that help students in Jewish day schools? Are there any that inhibit students? What should their role be in supporting students' learning? How many communities can support students' learning? Thinking back to the example of the student projects on medical ethics, we see that students are engaged with others' community, and the community is engaged with the school around real, authentic problems linked to expertise in the community around learning in community. Okay, now we're going to move to the second strand, which is social capital. And I provide you a second example. Convincing evidence shows that community service requirements and service learning lead to longer-term civic engagement. Community service is already widespread. 5 recent surveys suggest that 25 to 35% of U.S. high schools already require community service, and some 42% of high school seniors in 1998 performed community service either in school or out of school. Service learning, which integrates community service into class learning, is a mechanism to develop social capital. Here's an example. A class on Jewish mitzvot requires a civic engagement component. Students commit a year of service. A service learning project involves teenagers working with Jewish senior citizens who live in assisted living facilities in the same community. During their visits, beyond the typical volunteer activities such as playing games and making Hanukkah cards, the day school students conduct oral histories, and they interview the residents about their history and their Holocaust experiences. The grown-up children of the senior citizens who are visited often send the school thank you notes and become new members of the school's community. Teachers strive for service projects that involve students in the planning, that involve face-to-face service over time, repeated interactions, and allow servers and those served to discuss and reflect on their experiences afterwards. These types of projects are the basis for developing relationships or social capital. Again, you notice the school is out in the community and the community is in the school. There's always this reciprocal relationship. Yes?
I think it might be helpful if you define your meaning of social
I'm going to right now. Thank you very much. Perfect timing. Okay. In simple terms, what is the definition of social capital? It can be summed up in 2 words. Relationships matter. Social capital refers to, and I quote, the set of resources that inhere in relationships of trust and cooperation between and among people. Or as coined by Robert Putnam, the noted professor, the features of social organizations such as network, norms, and social trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit is the definition of social capital. It seems to me that given the crisis in Jewish continuity and Jewish identity, the formation of social capital both within school communities and between schools and their situated external communities should be a very explicit and important goal of school-community relations. Social capital is a popular term. In fact, there is an organization that sums up the essence of its meaning, bettertogether.com. It's their logo. And it says, connect with others, build trust, get involved. And on their website is literally a list that is 150 things to do to build social capital. One of the things on their list happens to be to collect oral history from older town residents, which we saw in the example, and that example is actually a service learning project that is occurring in our Jewish Day School in Nashville, Tennessee. Social capital has become an important concept in explaining the mechanisms by which communities and schools interact. The essential characteristic of social capital is, in fact, that it resides in the relationships among individuals within a social organization. The educational benefits occur when the community as a whole values education and shares some degree of oversight for all children. Much of the research on social capital dates from a seminal study published in 1987 by sociologists James Coleman and Tom Hoffer, who looked at the academic effects in public and Catholic high schools in the United States. The positive effects they found in the Catholic sector were linked, they believed, to the social structures that supported Catholic schools. They posited a set of overlapping norms and relationships that supported educational achievement and greatly enriched the resources available to any individual student. The social capital, as Coleman termed it, was as vital to student success as the physical, human, and financial capital that supports learning. The idea of social capital speaks about overlapping webs of relationships, networks of civic engagement that enrich the quality for life of any individual residing in society. Such networks foster robust norms of reciprocity, facilitate communication, and develop trust. And they embody past successes at collaboration, which can serve as a culturally defined template for future collaboration. If we have mutually trust, then it's easier to begin to define avenues for future collaboration. Finding better ways to build social capital is essential focus for school leaders. One way to do this is through the building of relational trust. A study of Chicago school reform indicated that relational trust is central to sustaining school improvement that is valued by a school's community. They identified 4 signs of identifying relational trust that are central for building social capital between a school and its community. The core aspects of relational trust include respect. Do we acknowledge one another's dignity and ideas? 2, competence. Do we believe in each other's ability to fulfill our responsibilities? 3, personal regard. Do we care about each other enough to go the extra mile? And 4, integrity. Do we trust each other to put children's needs first, even in the face of tough decisions? We suggest that these same signs can help rethink the nature of interactions between Jewish day schools and their external communities to build social trust. What does the concept of social trust and social capital mean for a Jewish community? Or what does social capital mean when we are thinking of the relationships between Jewish day schools and their communities? It's not something that I've seen written. Clearly, there are different levels of analysis. There is social capital for an individual child and students, and there is social capital for the school at an institutional level. At the school level, rich social networks may help to create some of the structures that better connect in-school learning with real-world context, or improve the degree to which teachers are aware of the knowledge students bring to school. As schools actively seek to use communities as context for learning and to bring respect to the cognitive structures that students have already formed, social capital may be an important element in developing the information needed to create opportunities for teaching and learning. A question: how can school leaders maximize the social capital already available in the community and co-create the kinds of networks that support educational success with their communities? What opportunities are associated with the renewed focus by school leaders on the creation of social capital? There are multiple demands on school principals. Significant attention to social capital will require major time and attention on the part of school leaders that may represent a displacement of focus from other critical factors affecting the school. What are the choices and priorities principals face, and how can distributed leader of the school work to maximize social capital? In this example, we saw service learning as a way of developing social capital, that social capital can be developed through civic engagement, such as cross-generational relationships, but these relationships are rooted and connected to the classroom activity over time. I now turn to our third example, which is community development. So we've talked about the new science of learning, we've talked about communities for social capital, and the third strand or mechanism is school community interactions for community development. Now, this may be utopia, but here's my example. The local Jewish day school decided to embark on a community outreach project to focus on learning Hebrew after conducting a needs assessment in the community. They embarked on the difficult process of engaging with other organizations, institutions, and synagogues in the same city to provide Hebrew instruction to adults, high school students for credit, local college students for credit, and school parents. The school truly became an invaluable resource to the community and over time developed extensive expertise by providing Hebrew language instruction. The Jewish day school students offer one-on-one tutoring in addition to the classes taught by teachers. This was a good use of the school's resources, since the year earlier, the Jewish Federation provided grant funding to the day school to purchase curricular materials and train their own teachers in teaching Hebrew. So the seed was planted by the day school receiving a Federation grant to have their teachers trained in Tal Am and Tal Sela, and then they reproduced this knowledge and expertise by teaching Hebrew outward into the community. Alex is smiling. During the process, negotiations among various interests were handled through a set of agreed-upon principles that now serve as a foundation for future collaborations. Some of the Hebrew classes met at the day school, while other classes met at the JCC, a senior center, and a synagogue. We see in this example, schools are a resource to the community. School investments are leveraged to serve the community. Students are part of the resources for the community. They are now not only learners, but are teachers by becoming one-on-one tutors to others. And schools are engaging with multiple institutions and role partners. In this case, Jewish day schools are the center or the axis of the wheel of Jewish education in the community. Jewish day schools are construed as the agents of community development. This perspective posits schools as proactive institutions that are integral parts of the overall development and growth of the community. Schools are seen as both the most universal and the most stable entity in communities that often face multiple challenges. From my experience, this is an undeveloped avenue of school-community collaboration for Jewish day schools. I think it is unusual for Jewish communities to think about their Jewish day schools as engines or agents of support and change for the community. In other words, the school is in the service of the community rather than the other way around. This view of schools as a vital and central force in supporting the community is not new. It emerges from the notion that public schools can be tools for community and economic development. A major report by the Harvard University Joint Center on Housing Studies stated, and I quote, "As a major place-based infrastructure, an integral part of the community fabric, public schools can have a profound impact on the social, economic, and psychological character of a neighborhood. Addressing public schools, therefore, is a good point of entry for community-based developers to place their work in a comprehensive community development context. In addition, integrating school reform and neighborhood vitalization is central to community development initiatives." This perspective was behind school reform programs in some of the major cities around the United States, Baltimore, St. Louis, and Atlanta, for example. In the public school arena, community development with schools often takes on such projects as providing better school-to-work transitions by developing better relationship with local employers, or creating schools that are joint-use facilities, such as adult job training in the evenings. Two elements distinguish this community development perspective from earlier efforts. One is the degree to which schools are integrated with other non-educational institutions as part of comprehensive community development, a stance termed the holistic perspective. This is also an ecosystem, a total environment supporting the healthy growth and development of a community. A second element is the degree to which collaborative structures across multiple institutions, in the Jewish community, for example, across foundations, synagogues, Jewish community centers, camps, work together with schooling to become collective agents of community development. Often referred to as the alliance model in sociological literature, existing institutions within a community, of which schools are the most prominent, come together to build the resources available to the community at large. Informal networks and arrangements together with formal structures help to provide support for the development of institutions within a community. At the heart of the community development movement are the ideas that community development changes the core identity of schools from isolated independent agencies to institutions enmeshed with community agencies in an internet-connected landscape of support for the well-being of students and learners and adults. It beckons schools to consider and respond to learning needs throughout the community, not just those of their own children in their own school building. With greater emphasis on community development, there is a necessary redefinition of the place and role of schools in the larger revitalization of communities, and a reassessment of the role of communities in the support of revitalization of schools. Recently, the concept of civic capacity has been applied to this notion of community development and school reform. Civic capacity is defined as the degree to which a cross-section coalition comes together in support of a task community-wide importance. The concept refers to the ability to build and maintain effective alliances for effective problem solving. Civic capacity emphasizes the collective role of community stakeholders, going beyond the view that any one single institution, such as schools or the Federation, can address the needs of its constituencies. In the education arena, the capacity of any set of stakeholders is limited, and so long as various players think and act in terms of a narrow view of their duty, they miss the full scope of the problem they face and the response to which they could contribute. Community development will not happen on its own. People from various agencies, institutions, and groups do not naturally come together to solve mutual problems and develop initiatives. Therefore, civic capacity denotes the motivation, community-mindedness, and activities necessary to address community-wide problems that are central to schools. Civic capacity goes far beyond the notion of social capital. Social capital relies on the development of reciprocity and trust. However, social capital may not transfer easily from one context to another or from one institution to another. Therefore, civic capacity involves the need for communal groups to put aside competitive impulses and focus on community-wide alliances. In fact, cooperative relationships and mutual problem solving between institutions and organizations can actually contribute to the development of civic capacity and social capital. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking back to your local context about the political and financial issues involved in this approach. For example, it is not unusual for institutions to compete for the hearts and minds and monies of the same community members. It is not unusual for an institution to think of their members as their own and thus be concerned that other institutions in the community may lure them away. What happens when a new synagogue wants to start in your community? Immediately the older synagogues get mad at those that may leave, as if the members are somehow their own property. For example, in one community, the day school could not overtly publicize their adult education offerings for fear of angering some of the other Jewish agencies offering adult education in the community. In fact, they were told that they could not place flyers in the local JCC because then the parents of those students would go to their adult education classes and not those that were being offered at the J. Obviously, a community development perspective negates this view of conducting community's business. We might want to think back to the 4 questions regarding relational trust when we think about building a community that is for all of our Jewish residents. Those relational trust aspects include respect, competence, personal regard, and integrity, rather than turf, ownership, and politics. Jack Wertheimer, in a recently developed Avichai report, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but I recommend it to many of you. It's called Linking Silos, correct. He asks the following, as he actually also talks about a community development perspective but doesn't use that term. Imagine a bus is driving from the preschool to the day school or supplementary school and then to summer camps, teen programs, and Israel trips. Who is working to get parents and children on board the bus rather than remain fixed in only one institution? Few communities offer such a bus service, and few educational professionals think it is their responsibility to play the role of bus driver, announcing the stops and encouraging riders to get on and off the bus at as many stops as possible. Who are our bus drivers in our communities? I once had this funny idea of reshaping the community. This is a crazy idea, such that there would be incentives for institutions to collaborate and cooperate. Right now, there's no incentives for community development because we're all competing against each other. I thought about a community-wide membership fee that afforded community members affiliation within a set or array of institutions in the community rather than a separate membership fee for each and every organization that one belongs to. Imagine you just belong to the Jewish community of Boston. And by belonging to the Jewish community of Boston for any one fee, you could then be a member to all the organizations. Would that somehow cut down this turf in politics? So imagine a person paid X amount of dollars and they could then be members to all the Jewish organizations in the community. Other questions that this community development perspective must ask. First one, is it a realistic possibility? Can we work as a community based on personal regard, integrity, respect, and competence? Second question, what school leadership arrangements would facilitate the school's ability to undertake its core educational mission in addition to community outreach, thinking, worrying, helping the whole Jewish community learn? Next question, what do we need to know about the pitfalls of this approach for school leaders? We caution again that there is little research that explores the downside of community development, the downside of spending too much focus on social capital. Jewish communities and their institutions with significant cohesion and connection to schools, we think, can greatly enhance the Jewish learning of all its residents. In sum, new directions are required for leading schools and communities to becoming joint contexts for teaching and learning. I believe a focus on student learning in community, the developing of social capital, and embarking on community development are good places from which to launch an endeavor that truly brings together schools and community for the purpose of learning and building Jewish identity. I know that this is an ambitious agenda, and I leave you with the question once again, can Jewish day schools meet the challenges raised by these conceptions of school-community collaborations? Thank you very much.
That was very good. Okay, here is how we will proceed. We will first hear our respondents, and that should leave us about 20 minutes for comments and questions from the audience. So, Professor Adler, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I welcome the opportunity of meeting Ellen again and having Annette as my chair here, and meeting Professor Parizhsky, whom I have met once before. I got to apologize to my Hebrew-speaking friends that I'm going to speak in English. I didn't know there will be translation, and I thought it would be unfair to some of you not to speak in English. And so you have to bear with my rather poor English, but I didn't conceive of these modern, of the modern technology to be applied here. To the phone? To the thing? Okay. Let me start by telling you in one short sentence where my problem lies with Ellen's paper. I have little, if any, argument with Ellen's thoughts about schools, schooling, and educational change. I do have a problem with the notion of community, which is central to the paper. The quote from John Dewey dates that you had in your paper dates back to 1897, which is more than 100 years ago, and no doubt that he had a far-sighted vision there, but he too was a utopian as far as schools are concerned, as you spoke about yourself as a utopian. I'd like to right away apologize for the chutzpah of me, the Israeli, making comments about Jewish community life in countries around the world, and thus about the notion of school-community interrelationship. As a sociologist of education, I surely approve of the basic concepts, as I said before, lined out by Ellen. I do believe, though, it is only fair to quote Ellen herself, who states, and I quote, that despite decades of reform, experimentation, and research on the relationships among parents, families, communities, and schools, the empirical knowledge base is still limited and characterized by the school-centric view. And this sentence refers not to Jewish, but to the general experience. I also have an argument with my friend and colleague Amitai Tzioni's definition of community. He speaks about shared meetings and shared values. However, I think that shared meanings and shared values do not suffice so as to serve as the basis for a community. In my humble opinion, the question for our discussion, race, schooling, and community, is whether and to what extent these meanings and values impinge on the daily lives of the community members and impact their behaviors, their living, their family practices, their gender relations, etc. I think I'm correct in stating that in the lives of the majority of Jews living around the world, I'm circumventing the word diaspora, Jewishness is a matter of worship, Some of them participate in worship, some of them don't. I loved the example of Jewish medical ethics in Ellen's paper. But how many Jewish doctors in the world are knowledgeable about the Jewish praxis, rare transplanting of organs? And how many are guided in their own medical praxis by these traditions? I would assume, moreover, that most Jewish doctors all over the world would be amazed to find out that medical practice in Israel is heavily impacted by legislation, which has its roots in Jewish tradition and halakha. In other words, many of the Jewish doctors around the world would be appalled by the lack of separation between religion and state in this country, rather than caring about the possible impact of such Jewish traditions on their own medical practices. I have no argument with Ellen about social capital in this school. I fully subscribe to a theoretical orientation in this matter. Though I'd like to remind you that Jim Coleman's, our friend, the late Jim Coleman's report about transition to work was published, I think, in '72 and contained these very same or similar ideas, and really very little happened in schooling generally as a result, and that was, he was a chairman of a commission. That was not his own writing only. There was, I forgot the name of it, but there was some kind of a commission that he headed, which came out with this report. I think it was '72, or maybe '73. Anyhow, I do claim, and would love to be corrected as not knowing enough about Jewish life out of Israel, that the civic environment of most Jewish adolescents in the world out of Israel is not the Jewish community, but the community at large. Jewish youngsters in America who had a social conscience went down south in the latter half of the last century to struggle for equal rights for persons in another but the Jewish community. Rich social networks, this is a quote, may help to create some of the structures that better connect in-school learning with real-world contexts. End of quote. Sure. But how many children and adolescents in the Jewish world outside of Israel, for how many children and adolescents in the Jewish world outside of Israel, is the Jewish community the expression of the meaningful real-world context? And a final remark about Ellen's argument regarding community development. I surely do go along with the notion of teaching Hebrew as a basic condition, these are my words, for the continued existence of the Jewish culture. The language embodies, in my humble opinion, embodies and represents our ethics, our mores, ways of life, and it conveys the origin of our people, our early poetry and philosophy, as well as the centrality of the land to our being. It is the common ground for both, in our lingo, the religious and the secular parts of our people. Yet the idea of turning Jewish high school students in America or in England or in Russia maybe, turning high school students whose main concern after all is to get into a good college upon high school graduation into a resource for teaching Hebrew in the community, an idea which I would welcome wholeheartedly, seems to be far-fetched and relevant to a very small select number of students in the Jewish world out of Israel. The majority of Jewish communities do not conceive of Hebrew, a language unknown to most community leaders there, as being essential to their lives and existence. I cannot but propose to you, and some here know that I do not belong to the camp of vulgar Zionism, that only via an Israel connection of the communities can community life become a meaningful ingredient in the lives of the Jewish day schools abroad. Thank you.
Ellen Goldring's
perspective on American Jewry and also world Jewry. Just wanted to throw out a couple of, basically make 2 points. One is the context is better than your examples portrayed, and 2, the ability of institutions to take action has a better record than you may have been hinting at, although you didn't directly address that. So just quickly on the context, let's take some 3 scattered examples from the diaspora. One is in England or the UK, the percentage of Jewish youngsters who go to day school, I think, if Marlene School is here,
More than 50.
I'm not Marlene, but 60%.
60%. It was 28% in 1992? Nachon?
Yeah.
All right, so there's an increase in day school enrollment in England from 28% to 60%. Many reasons for that, money being one of them. But there's certainly a lot of kids in day school. And if I'm not mistaken, having studied England a little bit, lots of kids with a very, very rich informal Jewish life that extends through university. Check that. I was meeting yesterday with an official from Toronto who tells me that since Birthright, it's only been around a few years, 9,000 Torontonian youngsters have been on Birthright. I did the quick math. There are 180,000 Jews in Toronto. You look at these relevant age groups. We're talking about the vast majority, between 51 and 99%, I'm not sure exactly where, of non-Orthodox Torontonian Jewish kids have been on Birthright. This is indicative of unusual strength in Toronto. Now American Jewry. It is true that there's been a huge decline in Jewish social networks. 2/3 of my generation have mostly Jewish friends. 1/3 of the next generation have mostly Jewish friends. However, that generation is burdened with a problem. Half of them are married to non-Jews. Among Jewish children, 3/4 of Jewish children have two Jewish parents as their parents, rather than one Jewish parent. And it turns out that Jewish children, Jewish teenagers, have mostly Jewish friends still. Now, that's a different world than the world that they will inhabit in 15 years. And last, in terms of the question you were asking, who's going to do this? There are two institutions that have the possibility of linking. One is very, very secure and prominent education institutions, which means day schools. They can do this themselves. They can do the linkage themselves on their own. Not all of them are prominent and secure. And the other institution are the supra communal institutions, federations, and outside philanthropists who can, and to some extent do, give incentive, and it hasn't been done yet. That's why we wrote Alex here as well, and I don't know if any other poets here. The reason we wrote Linking the Silos was to say, you federations, you philanthropists, you have an opportunity, and therefore a responsibility to help link those silos, to create the Community Alliance for Jewish Education. It can be done. There are variations in enrollment in transitions from preschools to day schools, from day schools to youth groups and camps and so forth and so on. And those variations indicate the possibility of different policies having an impact, and those policies can be put into effect. And you're right, there is no incentive for any director of any institution to send my kids to some other institution, but it happens and it can be changed.
I just have a funny story. Does this need to be on?
It's good.
Okay. Because many people think actually the situation in smaller Jewish communities is worse, or that your comments would be actually more applicable to smaller Jewish communities. And I actually think the opposite is true. And as sociologists know, when you're in a smaller community and there's pressure from the other, then you look more inward. So I won't mention a name, but there's good friends who moved actually from New York to Nashville by telling the story. Most people probably know who it is, but I still won't mention the name.
Very foxy.
Anyway, the funny thing is that we just saw him, and he said that he was sending his children this summer after JCC Day camp to this other camp, and I said, that's run by the YWCA, and there'll probably be some interesting experiences for your children, Nashville Bible Belt. And he said, yes, I know, but I think it's time that they have some experiences outside of the Jews. He says they have zero interaction with non-Jews now. Jewish day school, JCC, synagogue, youth group, summer camp. He says they don't know any non-Jews.
Yes, please, Judge Brooks. Okay, perhaps you state your name, every person, before you speak.
Josh Glazer from the University of Michigan. I have a question for Adler, which is that the vision of school leadership was interesting and appealing. Yet, as you were speaking, I couldn't help but thinking that it is an implicit vision of school leadership that runs 180 degrees opposite to the current reform movement in the United States vision of instructional leadership. And I say that for this reason. you kept talking about having leaders looking out to the community. All reform efforts and people thinking about reform-oriented school leadership and instructional leadership and principalship say principals have for too long focused out. What they need to do now is to focus in on the problems of teaching and learning. For the first time, principals actually have to not worry about Tekes Chanukah, Tekes Pesach, Tekes Siyum, or having the bagel and coffee hour. They need to worry about the very serious problems of teaching and learning in their schools. What kids are learning what and what kids are not learning. What professional development opportunities are needed for teachers. So it seems to me a real contradiction between your vision and this broader vision of what kind of forward-thinking school leadership is.
Obviously, it's a great question. So obviously in a setting when you're asked to speak about something, sometimes you paint a little bit of a black and a white picture to make the point. If I were asked to give a lecture on school leadership, I probably would have presented something more balanced. However, you mentioned, instructional leadership in school reform, and let's remember the Jewish day schools. And I apologize because I really only know the United States. The Israeli education system, but when we say Jewish day schools, we really mean I can only speak to you about the United States. But remember, in the United States, when you talk about educational reform, and I'm sure you're referring to No Child Left Behind and all those types of things that are going on now, we have totally different populations with totally different types of problems. That's number one, I would say. Number two, it's not an either or. And so I think, yes, we need to look at teaching and learning, but most of the things that I'm suggesting should support and enhance teaching and learning. And in my questions, like what are some of the things to think about, I think this is always an issue. How do you balance the multiple roles that a school head, especially in a day school context, who has a board and a lot of other pressures? I mean, how do you wrestle all these things? And that's why it's really important who your support staff are, how you're staffing, what is the expertise of the other people. I mean, is there an assistant principal who can really be an instructional leader versus being a disciplinarian or a fundraiser? I mean, it's just an array of staff. But I think you're right. In reality, we have to have a balanced perspective. You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I hope my paper didn't come across saying, though, what my vision is the bagels and lox and the Tekes Siyum and the Tekes Chanukah, because I'm really searching for a much more meaningful, fundamental relationship rather than the ceremonial symbolic, which is so often the name of the day. But you're right. Yes.
My name is Reuven Lieben. I have a few comments. I think that people who speak out, I think they should go to the microphone. It would help the translators. Otherwise, the questions cannot be heard by the...
Good point.
Anyway, my name is Reuven Lieben, and my comments are something which many of you are thinking about, how to reinforce Judaism and Jewish culture, particularly among those who come from non-religious or complete secular backgrounds. Now, in many of your schools, you have children who were with their parents in Israel on a sabbatical, or their parents, and they lived in Israel for a number of years. Maybe their parents were Israelis who left Israel, and they may still speak Hebrew at home. I believe that if the school would seek out these children who try to become more Americanized or Canadianized or so forth, and encourage them to keep up with their tradition, and offer them books which such as the Shita, or the system of Haramati, what they call Shiktuf Hadidakti, or a readability, which system which I can tell people during the break about. It would certainly encourage those children to keep up with their Hebrew and develop a love of Hebrew, because just as...
So the idea of a secular Jewish school was not foreign to the thinking of Soviet people. Thirdly, some Soviet Jews were eager to learn about Judaism and Jewish culture. And last, there was plenty of external financial, curricular, and in some cases, personnel assistance available to the establishment of Jewish schools. These then were the factors that bode well. Those that militated against the establishment of comprehensive Jewish schools, or that such schools did not exist for several generations. There were no teachers, books, curricula, alumni, administrators, buildings, or funds. A Jewish school had to start from nothing. Moreover, whereas the majority of Jewish schools in the West had a religious coloration, Soviet Jewry was and remains an overwhelmingly secular population, and even those Jews who define themselves as religious believers do not necessarily translate that into an affiliation with Judaism, and even those who identify Judaism as the religion which they prefer do not translate that, by and large, into greater observance of what religious Jews would call mitzvot. More importantly, there was only a nascent organized community in which the school could function, and therefore the role of external agencies was magnified, and I will not take the trouble to list those agencies, except that to say the external inputs have been completely unreflective of world Jewry. The denomination which calls itself the largest single Jewish denomination in the United States, the Reform Movement, as far as I know, is involved in no Jewish schooling in the former Soviet Union. The second largest denomination, the Conservative Movement, as far as I know, is active in only one city, in Chernivtsi, in Ukraine. The denomination, which according to the National Jewish Population Surveys is probably just a fraction of a fraction, i.e., a small fraction of the roughly 10% of American Jews who define themselves as Orthodox, namely the Hasidic group and especially Chabad, that is the overwhelming presence in Jewish schooling. What is the structure of Jewish education in the former Soviet Union? My flawed understanding, and I'll be very happy to hear from those people who really do know what they're talking about, who are sitting here, is that there are four types of comprehensive schools with Jewish components. There are public schools in Russia and Ukraine I'm talking about. I'm leaving aside the Baltic for a moment, Moldova, Azerbaijan, etc. There are public schools with a national component. Could be Ukrainian, Jewish, Armenian. And these schools receive between 15 and 20% of their budgets from the state, which go to salaries for teachers and maintenance of the premises. Second, there are semi-private schools sponsored by the state, but Jewish organizations take responsibility for renovated premises that serve Jewish instruction. Third, there are schools within schools, wherein a part of the premises are set aside for Jewish instruction. And finally, there are private Jewish schools, most of which are religious. Now, in the state schools with a national component, the number of hours assigned to each subject is strictly regulated by the state, which means, as far as I understand, that between 4 and 8 hours per week can be allocated to Jewish subjects, although there are some ways of infusing, let's say, art or music with Jewish content. One example of a school within a school, the second type, is the Bialik School in Minsk, in Belarus, which operates within State School 132. Here it is said, 275 students, and now listen carefully, with Jewish backgrounds receive 7 hours a week of instruction in Hebrew, Jewish history, literature, and geography. Note that there is no instruction in Bible or Judaism, nor are there any religious activities. And this is true in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, which have tried to keep religion and the state separate, although in Russia there's extreme pressure by the Russian Orthodox Church to insert itself, first of all, into the military, then into the schools, and into the media. Private religious schools provide lunches and transportation, and these are major attractions for the poorer segments of Jewish society. If you look at a school like Or Sameach in Odessa, or the two schools that Rabbi Yaakov Bleich runs in Kiev, these are dormitory schools, and you know something about the children and their parents, and oftentimes you know nothing about their parents because the children don't. You understand that these schools serve as much a social function as they do an educational one, if we can even make such a distinction. One of the ironies of schools in the FSU, and not in the FSU alone, is that for many years, many schools encouraged emigration, and most particularly Aliyah. And therefore, these schools were seen by parents as prep schools for life in Israel. That is less and less the case as the emigration has dwindled very significantly. In 1997-98, the Institute for Jewish Education of the Petersburg Jewish University surveyed Jewish education in the FSU and enumerated 51 Jewish day schools, 19 in Russia and 16 in Ukraine, with almost 11,000 students and nearly 1,600 teachers. That had been a significant increase from 92-93. And since then, it seems to me, since 2002 certainly, the number of schools and students seems to have declined. Avichai reports in 2002 about 70 day schools with a combined enrollment of nearly 12,000 students, grades 1 to 11. And in 2006, if you add together the students from the Baltic, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, I calculate something between 7,000 and 10,000 students, a drop from the previous 12,000. Who or what can explain this decline? Emigration in the early years, but no longer. What explains the decline is the demographic catastrophe of former Soviet Jewry. The 1959 census, the first taken after World War II, in which at least 1.5 million Jews were murdered, found that the average Jewish family size was 3.1 persons. Roughly one child per family, which was not enough already in 1959 for population replication. In 1994, 6% of the core Jewish population was 14 years or younger. 13% of the enlarged Jewish population, meaning core Jews and non-Jewish household members, were in that cohort. 21% of the emigres were under 14. This is natural. In all migrations, the young are overrepresented. But any demographer will tell you that if you have only 6% or even 13% of your population under 14, you have an unlikely future. Fertility is extremely low, intermarriage extremely high, over 80%, mortality is very high. That's one problem. The second problem, and here some of the people in the audience may disagree, seems that some of the Jewish schools are unable to compete in quality with the best schools in a city. Another problem is that families often see Judaic studies as the least important component of the curriculum, and most are unfamiliar with the material, of course, and unable to help their children with it. And we will return to that. On the other hand, in some places, these Jewish schools are superior to the neighborhood schools, and they have the reputation of having smaller class sizes, fewer problems with drugs and sexual experimentation, and these are attractive to parents. some of the schools, finally, will accept only children who are Jewish according to halakha, meaning who have a Jewish mother, who in turn had a Jewish mother. And that is a vanishingly rare species in the countries we're talking about. The Chefziba program, which was discussed by Ira and Uriel earlier, is an Israeli program. It's heavily oriented toward Israeli history, geography, and culture in public schools. Sometimes Bible is included as part of the literary heritage of Israelis. Many of the students participating in those programs are not halakhically Jewish, but are eligible for Aliyah. Some make no claim to any form of Jewishness. And the teachers are often unable to communicate in Russian, let alone Ukrainian, not necessarily trained in the subjects which they are teaching, and the curriculum is not structured for building Jewish communities in the former Soviet Union. But they have a new constituency: returnees from Israel. Kids whose parents have come back either temporarily or permanently. Reminds me of the Romanian Jew who finally left for Israel and 6 months later was back in Romania, and 6 months after that was back in Israel. And after several such trips, the Romanian border guard came to recognize him. And on his last entry to Romania, he said, "Yankel, what's this going back and forth? I can't decide where to live." He says, "Well, that's easy. Where do you feel most comfortable?" He says, "To tell you the truth, I feel most comfortable on the plane." If you want to put it more graciously, we'll call it globalization, internationalization. Me fort, me leeft hin und zurück, ahin nachher. A Geschäft da, a Geschäft dorten. Me macht business. So the kid who's gone for 4 years to some Mamlachti or Mamlachti Dati school in Israel suddenly finds himself or herself back in Kharkov. What's he supposed to do? Well, he goes to school 170. And he gets a kind of Israeli education. And his parents are told, you know, this kid is really good in Hebrew, knows a lot of Jewish history, but boy, is he behind in math and in science. V'hamevin yavin. Religious schools are funded and staffed largely by the Hasidic groups, Chabad and Karlin Stolin, the latter group active mainly in Belarus and Ukraine. Chabad considers the FSU its home territory. After all, it was born in Mogilov province of Belarus. It spread to Ukraine. The Frierdike Rebbe, as they call Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, was forced to leave the Soviet Union in 1929. And after his departure, there was still a Jewish underground Chabad presence. And so, in a sense, they have reclaimed their territory. They also have people who are willing to go, believe it or not, for more than 1 year, and who are not going to make extra money, but see this quite literally as a mission, which few other Jewish organizations can claim. Chabad has made a political alliance with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and it serves, this marriage of convenience serves both parties very well. Not surprisingly, almost all the schools suffer from a lack of qualified teachers, a lack of age-appropriate texts in Jewish subjects and in Hebrew instruction. And one study that was done by 2 local Jewish educators says there's no comprehensive, for example, this is Rotman and Rochlin, there's no comprehensive curriculum for the 11th grade. There's no Jewish curriculum. Let's take a look at some of the sponsorship of these schools. This is the year 2001. 74 schools. You see Chabad, other religious schools. Together, more than the non-religious schools. Religious schools were over 60%. What's Jewish about these Jewish schools? I use that term freely and loosely, Jewish schools. What does it mean? It's not surprising, in light of the demographic situation I described, that some of the students are not Jewish by anyone's definition, including their own. This holds true in Hungary, in Poland, and in other post-communist countries, as well as in some schools in the United Kingdom and perhaps in the United States. Now, some argue that the non-Jewish students in those schools, which, for example, in the Warsaw School are half, absorb some Jewish culture, gain respect for Jews and their culture or religion. And we should ask whether this is justification enough for Jewish organizations who appeal for funds to provide Jewish education to Jewish children. Perhaps it is, but no one is willing to raise the issue publicly. And what about the two-way flow of influence? If half your children are not Jewish, why do you assume that the influence will flow from Jewish children to the non-Jewish children rather than reverse? Now, a very reasonable argument could be made, in my view, that in order to provide Jewish students with Jewish education, in light of the absence of Jewish students, it is economically and pedagogically necessary to include non-Jewish students. In 6 schools studied in Moscow in the late 1990s, of the 540 students responding, 40% said, accept anyone with some Jewish roots. 17% of the students said they did not consider themselves Jewish, and another 12% said they did not attribute any nationality to themselves. So only 64% define themselves as Jewish. Very few of the students or the parents claim to observe Shabbat, Kashrut, fast on Yom Kippur, etc. Nearly half the students said it made no sense that Jews should choose a Jewish spouse. Among the parents, only 30% agreed, and 55% said Jews should marry other Jews. On one issue, parents and children were in agreement, which doesn't happen all that often, as some of you know. They were asked, what subjects do you regard as of major importance? 95% of the students and 97% of the parents said foreign languages, math, Russian, literature. This shows you how the Soviet Union has deteriorated. But note, all the Jewish subjects fall below the 50% line. All the Jewish subjects are less important than all the non-Jewish subjects. And among the Jewish subjects, the least important are Torah and basic Judaism. This was a study of 4 schools, including one whose principal is among us, but including 2 religious schools. And unfortunately, I don't have the data to be able to separate out the answers for the religious and the non-religious schools. Now, if you're an American Jewish educator looking at this, you say, give up. But if you know anything about the Soviet system, you say, I'm not at all surprised. How could it be otherwise? First of all, those bottom subjects are not practical. Do they lead to a career, to a profession? Secondly, Papa, Mama, even Diedushka, Babushka, Zayder Bobe, didn't transmit anything of that to me. Why should I be so enamored of these things? So the Jewish schools in the former Soviet Union are a failure, right? They are failing to transmit a commitment to and an interest in Jewish subjects. Not true. Why not? Not because I'm a Jewish organizational chinovnik who is trying to say the right things and keep the funds flowing, but because the same survey found something fascinating. The kids loved their schools, and they liked them much better than the previous schools in which they had been. They didn't want to leave those schools, even if there were a better school, except when they got older and had to think about college. Is it the ethnic character of the school? Is it because they are Jews among Jews? I don't know. I do want to quote one student whom I was able to interview. She was my student at the Central European University in Budapest recently. And she gives us a clue as to the attraction of such schools. She went to the school in Kharkov for only 2 years. She comes from a completely Jewish and completely non-religious family. She now recites the Shema twice a day and happily eats tarfus. She occasionally attends religious services. She speaks fluent Hebrew and English. She's been to Israel more than once. She's completing an MA in Judaic Studies at Central European University. This is Irina's comment on the school. This was not just a school. This was a community, a place we could hang out. They have sports. We loved communicating with Israelis and Americans. And you know, in no other school in all of Ukraine could you go to the principal with a problem. What this leads me to suspect, and this returns me to a discussion that was held here this morning and back to Deborah Meyer's talk of last night, is that Jewish schools at the very minimum have the potential, and in fact have already in many cases done, to create communities, to create networks of Jews who are now no longer identified officially on their internal documents as Jews. That's no longer the case in Russia and Ukraine, but who identify with each other. We don't know what will happen in the future, and maybe we have rightly spent most of our time building, and only later shall we evaluate. After all, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin once said, supposedly quoting Napoleon, "On s'engage et puis on voit." First you do it, and then you see. Let me conclude with my own observation, which is that one could not reasonably expect schools that started over a decade ago with no financial or educational resources of their own, not buttressed by thriving, well-knit, strong communities, schools which admittedly enjoyed external support and what Hochstein Veblen called the advantage of the latecomer, to produce results other than the ones I showed you. But I am reminded of a discussion which I had in Budapest this past February with a young Jewish couple, both Jews, highly educated, professionals, thoroughly Magyarized. And I asked them, what makes you Jewish? And the answer was our social and political values, liberal values. And that makes us associate with other Jews. And I argued, surely there are Magyars, real Magyars, not Jews who have been pretending for 300 years to be Magyars, who have those values. And their answer, which I don't believe, but which may be true, was, no, but it was we Jews who brought these values to the Hungarians. Whatever the accuracy of this analysis is, the fact that it is believed by a young post-communist couple, and that its consequences are the formation and sustaining of Jewish social networks. And Anna, you will confirm this. I was told that the graduates of the Lauder School, without any formal agreement, together with the other kids from the other two schools, the Schreiber School and the Maserot Avot, informally gather at a certain cafe at a certain time, and they just know that's the place to be. These are the graduates. This, to me, it seems, might be the first step, and only the first step, to the achievement of what I would consider far-reaching goals. I profoundly disagree with a Jewish educator in the United States who recently told his teaching staff in a day school, those of you teachers who are content-driven ought to think about leaving this school, because this school is about making kids feel happy, wanted, and loved. Balderdash. The Jewish school is about teaching Jewish subject matter. Thank you.
Gilda?
שלום, צהריים טובים. Professor Gittelman began his presentation in Yiddish, so after that I feel free to make my reference in Hebrew, the second Jewish language. So everybody, if you need translation, please use technology. Like this?
No.
I need help, people. צהריים טובים, אני אתייחס לדברים של פרופסור גיטלמן בעברית. יש תרגום, אני מניחה שגם לרוסית. אתם שומעים שם את הדברים שלי ברוסית? אני מניחה שאני הוזמנתי להיות אחת מבין שני המגיבים לדבריו של פרופסור גיטלמן, אולי על תקן אותו צ'ינובניק ארגוני שדואג להזרמת הפאנס לשטח. לא, זה בסדר, אני רגילה, אני מוזמנת לזה על בסיס קבוע. אולי הוזמנתי להגיב על הדברים על תקן אחד הארגונים הקולוניאליסטיים שכבשו את השטח של החינוך הפורמלי, כמו גם שטחים אחרים בחמה. אולי הוזמנתי גם כי אני יודעת משהו ביוגרפית על מחויבות ועל ידע, כן, שאתה הזכרת, פרופסור גיטלמן, ועל ההבדל ביניהם בהיסטוריה של הקהילה הרוסית הזאת. אולי בגלל שלושתם גם יחד, אני אנסה להתייחס בקצרה לסיפור בתי הספר בחמה שאני מלווה אישית בתוקף תפקידי בשלוש השנים האחרונות, אולי משלוש הזוויות האלה גם יחד. השאלה שמוצבת במרכז הפרזנטציה של פרופסור גיטלמן שואלת, האם לבתי הספר היהודיים בחמה יש אימפקט? האם הם עושים את ההבדל? make a difference? שאלה שמוצבת כבר בעמוד הראשון של הפייפר שקיבלתי לפני הפרזנטציה. וזו שאלה שאני מציבה בפני עצמי בכל אחד מהביקורים שלי בבתי הספר. השאלה הזאת היא לא שאלה קלה. אני רוצה לספר לכם על אחד הקוריוזים המצחיקים סלש עצובים באחד הביקורים האחרונים שלי, באחד מבתי הספר המוזכרים על ידך. אתם גם תוכלו לנחש לפי תוכן הקוריוז, לפחות באילו בתי ספר מדובר, באחד מאילו בתי ספר מדובר. אחד הדברים הקשים ביותר שאיתם מתמודדים פקידי הסוכנות היהודית, ואני מניחה גם ה-JDC, אלה קבלות פנים בנוסח מאוד מאוד חגיגי, שעורכים לכבודם בכל אחת מהמסגרות שנתמכות על ידי הכספים של הארגונים. כן, הילדים עומדים, הילדים שרים, הדגלים מונפים, השיירה עוברת, סיטואציה די מביכה אם תחשבו על זה.
זה רק בסוכנות.
מהביקורים באחד מבתי הספר ששייכים לרשת חפציבה, זכיתי במרכאות או שלא במרכאות לקבלת פנים כזאת. ועמדה שם הקהילה של ילדי בית הספר ושרה מספר שירים בעברית. שרה מאוד יפה. ואז ניגשתי לילד אחד מסוים שנראה מאושר במיוחד לשיר, אמרתי לו, איזה עוד שירים אתה מכיר, איזה עוד שירים אתה אוהב לשיר? הוא אמר לי, את רוצה שאני אשיר לך עוד שיר אחד בעברית? אמרתי לו, כן, בשמחה, איזה שיר תבחר? הוא אמר לי, ההמנון. אמרתי לו, נהדר. ואז הילד ניגש למיקרופון ופצח בגאווה בשירת ההמנון הלטבי. זה היה הרגע ששאלתי את עצמי מה בעצם אנחנו חושבים שאפשר להשיג בבית ספר יהודי, שעברית זו השפה הרביעית הנלמדת בו, אחרי רוסית, אחרי לטבית, אחרי לטבית, אחרי רוסית, אחרי אנגלית, כן, ואז באה אותה עברית. זה בחירה, כן? בחירה. מה אנחנו מצפים מאותו ילד שאני מניחה שזוכה למשלחות בתדירות שלא הייתה מביישת את אחד הספרים הכי מפורסמים שקראנו חלקנו בילדות, כן, שאנשים לפי טיב המשלחת היו שמים את התמונה הנכונה על הקיר, כן, עד שאותו כפרי פעם התבלבל, שם את התמונה על הנכונה של לבן במקום אדום או אדום במקום לבן וסיים לא טוב את אותו היום. מה הם הערכים שאנחנו מקנים לילדים שמתחנכים בבתי הספר האלה סביב אותן הצהרות מאוד מאוד גבוהות שאנחנו גם מאוד מאמינים בהן, של ה-Jewish peoplehood, כן, העמיות היהודית, השותפות היהודית, הערבות היהודית שמביאה כל כך הרבה יהודים בליווי אנשי הסוכנות היהודית לבתי הספר כדי לראות באיזה אופן מושקעות התרומות. מה אנחנו באמת משיגים שם? גם ברמה של חינוך ערכי, ולא רק לימודי עברית או שירים ישראלים. והתשובות הן לא פשוטות. אני רוצה לחזור אחר כך לאותה אילוסטרציה ולהגיד מה אני חושבת על הסיפור הזה, אבל אני קצת רוצה לסטות מהסיפור. בניגוד לארבעה דגמים של בתי ספר שהוצגו כאן, אני מצאתי בשטח לפני 3 שנים, כשהתחלתי את סיפור ההיכרות האישית שלי עם התחום הזה, 44 מודלים נפרדים. אני מתקשה היום להצביע על יותר מבית ספר אחד שמשתייך למודל. ההבדלים בין בתי הספר הם הבדלים אדירי מימדים בכל אחד מהפרמטרים שאנחנו יכולים להעלות על הדעת. אם אנחנו מדברים על המנהלים, שלשמחתי אחדים מהם נמצאים איתנו כאן אחר הצהריים הזה, ישנם מנהלים שבית הספר הוא היצירה האישית שלהם, שהם הגו את רעיון הקמת בית ספר יהודי מיד בסמוך להתמוטטות האימפריה הסובייטית, שהם יצרו את בית הספר במו ידיהם, שהם השקיעו בו את כל חייהם, חלומותיהם, יכולותיהם, ובית הספר הזה הוא הם עצמם. ישנם כאלה שבתי הספר אפילו מכונים על שמם, בעודם בחיים, שיזכו לחיים ארוכים עד 120. ישנם מנהלים שמשמשים כבובות על חוט על ידי המפעילים הנמצאים מאחורי הקלעים, הרבנים, נציגי הרשתות, נציגי הקהילה המקומית, או אחת מבין הקהילות המקומיות שטוענות להגדיר את עצמן כהקהילה המקומית של אותו מקום. ישנם מנהלים יהודיים, ישנם מנהלים לא יהודיים. מבין המנהלים הלא יהודיים ישנם כאלו שראו בסיפור הזה של הקמת מגמה יהודית בתוך בית הספר הכללי מעין הזדמנות עסקית לא רעה להתברג לנישה שהיא נישה פנויה, היא מתוקצבת לא רע, היא מביאה הרבה מאוד דיבידנדים. אני אפילו מכירה מנהלת אחת שנקלעה להרפתקה הזאת של הקמת מגמה יהודית בבית ספר כללי באחת מהבירות הרוסיות, משום שאיש לשכת הקשר ששכנע אותה להיכנס לזה היה יפה תואר במיוחד, נשבעת לכם. ישנם מנהלים שמנהלים אורח חיים חילוני לחלוטין בבית ואורח חיים דתי בתוך בית הספר. ישנם מנהלים ששינו את כל תפיסת עולמם היהודית אחרי שהגיעו לבית הספר וכו' וכו' וכו'. ישנם בתי ספר דתיים שפתוחים אל העולם היהודי המודרני ואל ערכי הפלורליזם וכמובן אל קיומה של ישראל לא רק כישות רוחנית אלא גם כישות יהודית ריבונית מודרנית. ישנם בתי הספר שתולשים את הפרקים האלה מתוך ספרי היסטוריה שאותם לומדים הילדים. אני דרך אגב נתקלתי באחד מבתי הספר המתוקצבים על ידי הסוכנות היהודית פרקים בתולדות עם ישראל, בתוכנית בתולדות עם ישראל שעוסקים בהקמת התנועה הציונית ובהקמת מדינת ישראל פשוט נתלשו מחוברות הלימודים ולא נלמדו. הייתה שם קפיצה מתודית מעניינת, כן, מעל הפרקים האלה. הפוליטיקה שבין מערכת היחסים שבין הקהילה או הקהילות לבית הספר נבדלת בכל אחד מהמקומות שבהם ביקרתי. ולצערי ישנו אולי מאפיין אחד שניתן להצביע עליו כמכנה משותף לבתי הספר, ואתה התייחסת אליו בדבריך. כל בתי הספר שביקרתי בהם, כל אותם 44 בתי ספר, לא מצליחים למשוך אליהם בגדול את הילדים של המשפחות היהודיות המכונות לצורך הדיון, כן, כאליטה יהודית מקומית. ונעזוב כרגע את ההגדרות הסוציולוגיות. אני תמיד טוענת שברגע שכולנו פחות או יותר מבינים על מה מדובר, אז כולנו יודעים על מה מדובר, ונניח להגדרות הסוציולוגיות. והסיבות לכך הוזכרו. הסיבות לכך הן שבית ספר אליטיסטי, גם בחמה, מבוסס קודם כל על עיקרון ההתקבלות מבין רבים שמאוד מאוד שואפים להתקבל לבית הספר. בית ספר יהודי מבוסס על עיקרון הפוך. בית ספר יהודי בחמה מקבל בהגדרה כל ילד שרוצה בכך או שמשפחתו רוצה בכך. ברגע שבית הספר מקבל את כולם, לא רק בארצות הברית היהודים לא רוצים להשתייך לקאנטרי קלאב שמוכן לקבל אותם. גם בחמה היהודים לא רוצים לשלוח את ילדיהם לבית הספר שכל כך בקלות מקבל אותם. זאת אומרת, ישנם מאפיינים יהודיים אוניברסליים בכל מקום אפשרי. אם נמשיך הלאה ונאמר שמקצועות היהדות שלא זוכים ליוקרה מיוחדת מכל הסיבות שהוזכרו בבתי הספר, לא רק שלא מוסיפים ערך מוסף עבור ההורים ששוקלים לרשום את הילדים שלהם, הם בעצם מינוס רציני מאוד, מכיוון שמשמעותם זה פחות שעות מתמטיקה, זה פחות שעות מדעים וזה פחות שעות אומנות. זה לא רק שהם לא מספיק חשובים. אז ניחא, אז שהילד ילמד גם משהו שהוא לא כל כך פונקציונלי והוא לא כל כך תורם להמשך חייו. לא. הדבר הרבה יותר חמור, כן, לתפיסת האנשים, המשפחות. הדבר אומר שאם משרד החינוך והסוכנות היהודית תובעים שלפחות X שעות תושקענה בבית הספר לטובת לימודי יהדות ועברית כתנאי להמשך התקצוב, הרי אותן שעות בדיוק באות על חשבון המקצועות האחרים. ודרך אגב, גם כאן מדובר באיזשהו מאפיין אוניברסלי. אני רוצה להתוודות בפניכם שכאשר הבת הקטנה שלי באה וסיפרה לי שיש לה בעיות בערבית והיא לא ממש מצליחה, אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? את השנה במילא מסיימת ללמוד ערבית. ביג דיל. לעומת זאת, כשהבת השנייה שלי באה ואמרה שלא כל כך מצליח לה בביולוגיה, למחרת גלריה של מתגברים, כוללת דודה אישית משפחתית, התייצבו בבית, מה זאת אומרת לא מצליחה בביולוגיה? אין מצב לא להצליח בביולוגיה. אנחנו מדברים פה על איזושהי היררכיה, כן? שגם אנחנו שותפים לה, גם כאן בישראל, ואני מניחה שגם בקהילות במערב. כאשר אנחנו מוסיפים לכך את כל גלריית הסיבות שהוצגו על ידי פרופסור גיטלמן, כאשר מסורת בחלק מבתי הספר נלמדת, או הילדים לומדים אותה מפי מורים שאינם דוברי רוסית, שהם מציגים אותה בשפה שבורה ולא מובנת, כשהתכנים הנלמדים רחוקים מעולם החיים ומעולם החוויה של הילד והמשפחה, כאשר תולדות עם ישראל נלמדות נלמדות לפעמים באותה שיטה ולא ברור מה ההבדל בינם לבין לימוד היסטוריה יוונית עתיקה. כאשר עברית לא זכתה במשך הרבה מאוד שנים להתייחסות רצינית הן בתחום המתודולוגי והן בתחום הקונספטואלי של הוראת שפה בהקשר התרבותי הכללי או הזהותי הכללי, יש לנו עוד הרבה מאוד מה לעשות. ובכל זאת, אני חושבת שבתי הספר היהודיים בחמה כן מייצרים אימפקט על חיי הילדים, על חיי המשפחות ועל חיי הקהילה המתהווה. הילדים חיים יחד עם בני גילם סביב פרויקטים גדולים ומרכזיים שלוקחים אותם ומעסיקים אותם בתחומים מסוימים, בדגשים מסוימים. פרויקט שורשים שמופעל היום בכל בתי ספר, כדוגמה, שמופעל היום בתוך כל בתי ספר יהודיים בחמה. כשבפרויקט זה הילדים יוצאים לחקר תולדות הקהילה שלהם, תולדות המשפחה שלהם בתוך הקהילה, בעבר ובהווה. לאחר מכן יוצאים בשנה, בכיתה מתקדמת יותר, יוצאים לסיור חינוכי לפולין ופוגשים שם משלחות של בני נוער מישראל ובמדינות אחרות, ולאחר מכן בכיתה האחרונה מגיעים במסגרת המשך התוכנית החינוכית לישראל, גם מבלי לדבר הצהרתית וארגונית ופוליטית, כן, כאשת הסוכנות היהודית שמצופה לדבר באופן מסוים, ברור לנו שחיי קבוצת השווים, כן, קבוצת בני הגיל באותן שנים, מתבססת הרבה מאוד על החוויה הקולקטיבית שנוצרת שם, והיא נוצרת שם, והיא נוצרת באופן חזק. אני כבר מסיימת, חיים. כאשר החיים הבלתי פורמליים של בית הספר, גם הם ממקדים את הילד ואת בני גילו בתחום מסוים, בעולם תוכן מסוים, יש לכך השפעה. ואני רוצה לסיים באותה אנקדוטה של אותו ילד ששר לי בגאווה את ההמנון הלטבי, שאני במקרה מכירה אותו, כי גם אני יוצאת המקום הזה, כן? אז במקרה יכולתי לשיר את זה איתו לפחות, כדי לא להביך אותו, מה שעשיתי, לתדהמת הרב המקומי שכמעט התעלף שם. זאת אומרת, זה שבר לו את כל הסטריאוטיפים על אנשי הסוכנות היהודית, אני מניחה. אני חושבת שאפילו המפגשים שמאוד קל לנו להציג אותם באור ציני ופוליטי וכמעט וולגרי, כן, של אותם מפגשים עם כל אותם משלחות של יהדות העולם שבאה, כן, שבאה לראות מה היא מייצרת במגרש המשחקים הזה שנקרא חמה, אפילו את זה אני יכולה לראות חינוכית באור אחר לחלוטין. אני חושבת שהחשיפה של התלמידים, של הילדים, לעולם היהודי הרחב, לקיום הרב-גוני והמורכב והמרתק שלו, לדמויות השונות והמשונות שמופיעות אצלו בבית הספר, כשהן לא דומות אחת לשנייה בשום דבר, פותח בפניו פתח לא ורבלי, אלא חווייתי, לתוך מה שאנחנו מכנים אותו חיבור לעולם היהודי העכשווי, חיבור גם לישראל וגם לקהילות העולם, דברים שבעצם עוברים בתוך אותם בתי ספר כמסרים הרבה מעבר לתוכניות הלימודים. אני רוצה לקוות שאנחנו נצליח בכוחות משותפים כן להמשיך ולקיים מחקר מסודר ושיטתי. אם יש משהו שאני חובקת בשתי ידיי בהצגה, זה את ההצעה להיכנס סוף סוף לתחום הזה בצורה רצינית, לערוך מחקר סיסטמטי שיבחן את מידת ההצלחה ואת מידת אי ההצלחה שלנו, של כולנו, ואני לא מבחינה עכשיו בין מי זה אנחנו וכולנו בתוך היוזמה הזאת, ואני מקווה מאוד שהמחקר הזה יאפשר לנו בעתיד גם לכוון את הצעדים, את צעדי המדיניות של כולנו נכון יותר ונבון יותר. תודה רבה.
Gender Absurdot. Barry.
I want to begin with a personal statement. It's very meaningful to me to come back to this place that has been my home for so many years and to see so many of my family here at home. So I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity. I too want to begin with the true original Jewish language and say, Walak mi samcha, who was so berserk to think that I should be one to respond to this paper. I'm not a historian. They must have mixed me up with a you-know-who. I'm not a historian of the FSU. I'm not a historian of Jewish education. I don't speak Russian, and I'm not conversant with Russian Jewish education. The only claimers, rather than disclaimers, I can give is that Chazan is Chazanovich, who came from Kiev. I've been going to the FSU since the 1970s, quite regularly, and officially my first trip was to visit teacher training colleges, Hamevin, Yavin. And the third, perhaps, credential is for the last 4 years, I've been working, setting up a post-programming initiative for Birthright alumni in the FSU. So I also thought it was strange, but I'm glad I took the assignment, Dinat Nuah, and I've taken the assignment. Now, there are two ways to deal with this paper. One is to deal with it as an FSU paper, and the other is to deal with it as a major keynote address. And I was going to go route one because it deserves it. It's an outstanding paper, no ifs or buts. But I'm going to go route two because it's an outstanding paper, in my opinion, with implications for a yet non-existent field, the field of comparative Jewish education. And therefore, I'm going to make 5 points, 5 larger points. My first point I call the grand myth. The copy of the paper that I received began as follows. Intensive Jewish education is seen as the most promising antidote for the assimilation of Jews in many countries, meaning the loss of Jewish identity and commitment, including Israel. This statement has become the mantra of modern Jewish life and philanthropy, not just in the FSU, in Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, in Nashville, and all over. This sentence, in some ways, for those of us in this field, is a kind of manna from heaven, which should make us happy. This sentence often vaguely refers to some definitive research which has proven the point. And as Tzvi indicated, this sentence is one of the great crimes and misdemeanors of contemporary Jewish life. There is no definitive research that I know of. Tzvi does quote the Himmelfarb research in the 70s. There was the Bach research at that time. He quotes Steve's work. Steve will be the first to say that his work was a modest study based on a certain sample. And more important, none of these studies encompass the methodologies of the grand, large educational studies, whether it be Coleman or Menkovich or Bashi. None of this research, for example, studied content, teachers, goals, and the like. All they studied was attendance or values. So there just is no big conclusive research, including at Park Avenue and 83rd Street, which is the headquarters of the Avichai Foundation. 85th. There are those, 85th, sorry. There are those who claim that there is a definitive study. There is the census that Marvin Schick has done. It's been useful, and other things. So there is a certain sense in which this sentence and a major assumption about contemporary Jewish life, one that many of us hope is right, and it has reinvigorated our work and our lives, doesn't have the hardcore evidence that philanthropists and others think there is. There is some kind of, I don't want to use the word hoax here, but there is a crime and misdemeanor. Point 2, the anti-education movement in Jewish education. The formulation of this sentence, not Tzvi's, because the way Tzvi formulated is the way that the Jewish world formulates it, is a statement about antidotes to a sickness. The assumption is there's a sickness out there, and we need medicine. This formulation is not a statement about a recipe for health or meaning. The Jewish people, at least in its formulations, is looking to and using day schools for a medicine for which it regards as the greatest enemy that exists, assimilation, intermarriage, and the like. The sense is there's a disease out there that needs to be cured. There are many people in the world of education there are some people in the world of education, there's one standing up here who believes that education is about meaning-making and socialization. And people and meaning are central and not assimilation or intermarriage. There's not a disease. There are people and a great culture. Point 3, the misnomer called the Jewish school. It may well be that Jewish schools are not schools at all, but rather social networks. In the 1980s, I did a study, an unpublished study of 3 Jewish day schools. One was at a place, a little street called Stein Circle in Newton, or Newton Center, Massachusetts. An exciting educator ran it then. It was clear he was destined to be a major voice in the Jewish day school movement. And it was a very good school. Teachers were good, the curriculum was good, coffee, the tea, everything was great. But you know what I discovered? I discovered the Schechter community. I discovered parents, and I discovered Grandparents' Day, and I discovered people who even davened together. By the way, I had expected within X number of years that school would also be a shul. I don't know what happened. I never followed it. That study was unpublished. Around the same time, I did a study in Australia of Mount Scopus College, of a study that was published, but none of you have ever seen it because it was hidden by the community. I was invited to prove what the title of your paper was, the impact of Jewish day schools on Jewish identity. Well, I didn't find it about the Mount Scopus College. I did find it about Chabad. So in 770, I have a special corner, but that research was never published. But what I did find in Mount Scopus too was the Mount Scopus community. There was a kind of world, and it was related a lot to incredible soccer fields and incredible achievement in grades as one of the top private schools, and a certain hubris of being part of a Mount Scopus graduate. So schools may well not be schools. They may be social networks. And it may be, by the way, that there are other routes that can also be just as effective. There are agencies, they're sitting in this room, that in the FSU went a different route. They went chesed, they set up libraries. You emphasize the importance of the intellectuality of FSU Jewry. In our birthright, by the way, post-programming, it is the only community we ask alumni, what do you want? And in most of the communities, in France, they tell you exactly what kind of wine they want. And in the States, it's either social action or it's parties and the like. In Argentina, it's fabulous meat. And in FSU, they wanted genealogy, Jewish history, and seminarim, or the equivalent word. So maybe there are other routes. And the one other example I would refer to in the FSU is the JC, the Jewish Community Center. What is the meaning in Russia? The Chabad Jewish Community Center. So point 3 is maybe it's a misnomer to call Jewish schools Jewish schools. Maybe what they really do is create Jewish environments. It may well be that they have less or little to do with Jewish literacy, and certainly little to do with your last challenge and desire. Point 4, the lack of a theory of mind or an identity theory in Jewish education. Theory of mind is what Freud referred to. Erickson changed it and spoke about a theory of identity. We have no clear theories of formulation of the nature of mind or the formulation of identity, in my opinion, in Jewish life. Maslow, Erickson, Kurt Lewin, Vygotsky, and many more developed theories of mind or identity and the like. Interesting, the names, by the way, and their ethnic or religious origins. We have never developed, in my opinion, a theory of Jewish identity development or a theory of Jewish mind. Schools cannot work without a theory of mind or a theory of identity development. Now, I know there's what's called and known in the world. When I was here, we called it that. And now abroad, I know the Jerusalem School. The Jerusalem approach to Jewish education emphasizes very much the importance of vision. And I'm part of that. I've always believed that vision's important. At the same time, it perhaps does a disservice by minimizing or by minimizing the role of psychological theories and by taking education out of the hand of educators and putting it in the hand of ideologues. If education is ultimately related only to vision, that means ideologues will write essays about what they think Judaism or Jewish life should be. That's not the way education works. Point 5. I call this the Benderly or Dushkin paradox. Samson Benderly was regarded as one of the founding fathers of American Jewish education. Alexander Dushkin was one of his major students, ended his years here. And the followers of Benderly were called the Benderly Boys and Girls, and they really set up North American Jewish education. There is a unspoken or hushed dimension of Benderly's writings and even Dushkin's writings. They had a certain uncomfortable feeling about day schools. And if you want to see an interesting revelation of that, look at a book that it's hard to find it. Dushkin's biography called Living Bridges. I know because I helped him in the end work on that book. He picked the pictures in the book. They were picked very carefully. And he loved to dress in a very elegant way. He wore jackets and ties in the summer, nice white shirts. Pictures of himself playing the cello. His brother was an accomplished cellist. He also had pictures of himself at Camp Modin. He had pictures of himself studying. But he, Dushkin and Benderly in that world, in my opinion, was deeply committed to what Cynthia Ozick calls the twin nobilities. By the twin nobilities, she referred to the culture that gave us Voltaire and the culture that gave us Amos and Hosea. The two great cultures that nourish us, and some of us believe are our mothers and fathers. So where does one learn these twin nobilities? There are some who say that this is complicated in a day school. However you look at it, a day school is not simply a private school. A day school is a certain kind of private school which may have at its core a particularism. Where did I learn about the twin nobilities? Ultimately, I learned it when I did a BA at Columbia College and a BA at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I was in heaven. I danced. Crossing 120th Street to in the morning study with Lionel Trilling and Eric Bentley, the great works of literature, and then in the evening with Hillel Bavli and with Shimon Halkin in Hebrew. I learned the twin nobilities there. By the way, there's one other place where I learned the twin nobilities, in my life here in Israel. So, the story that Zvi Gittleman told us today is actually in some ways one of the better, I even wrote here the best, but I'll go with the best. One of the best tellings and uncoverings of the 5 myths of Jewish day schools that I've heard in a lot of years. I want to conclude by introducing you to a friend that I only met recently that we all should have known more about. His name is Siegfried Bernfeld. He was a highly regarded member of Freud's inner circle. He lived from 1892 to 1953. In 27, he emigrated to San Francisco and was a psychoanalyst for the rest of his years in San Francisco. He was a founder of Zionist youth movements in his teens. He, together with Erickson and a few others, set up some experimental schools based on psychological theories of mind and identity development. And he was even planning, and he set up for 6 months, a Jewish experimental school. The name of his book is Sisyphus, or The Limits of Education. Bernfeld urged the members of the education profession, that's all of us sitting here, to learn the psychic and social realities of our work or otherwise we're going to see our labors condemned to the futility of Sisyphus. So I guess if I were to restate Bernfeld, what I'm saying is once we recognize the limits of schools, and when he used education, he meant schools, once we recognize the limits of schools, then again in Cynthia Ozik's words, maybe the sky is the limit, or as she said, ad astra. Maybe then we could really fly in education. The danger may be if we believe that education's potential is limitless. If we believe that, we might be doomed to the travails of Sisyphus or to that guy who spent most of his life fighting windmills.
Thank you, Barry. We have some time for questions. I'm told that the brief dinner, or whatever it's the reduced dinner, dietetic evening meal, will be at about 6 o'clock, and so we can have some questions for either Tzvi or either of our respondents. Bevakasha. Gerda's comment is that dinner will only be served if there are questions. Please, Shaul.
I must say, I'm eating dinner at home. I'm just asking out of curiosity. I found it quite interesting, the rating of the different topics in terms of importance, with foreign languages on top and Jewish topics down below. I know the answer as to what is important in Israeli high schools. So I'll ask, has a similar study been done in American community high schools? And I would be willing to risk a fair amount of money that if it hasn't been done and would be done, it would be important to write down where it was done, because otherwise it would be difficult to see the difference. But you can prove me wrong.
Do you want to respond to that or ask another question? Is there a direct response to Shaul?
You win the bet. No question. I mean, it's, in my opinion, Josh, you got to jump in this. You cannot be a successful Jewish day school in most countries of the world unless you're an outstanding general school. In Venezuela, ministers, at least in the past, non-Jewish ministers were lining up to get their kids into the school because it was the best school in Venezuela. So, yes.
I found in Eastern Europe, there the Jewish topics were most important. But there the tough students got a shidduch, and they got everything that came with the shidduch. And as long as you don't have that, then the rules of the game change.
Okay, on that happy note, Jonathan?
I leave kind of troubled by the presentations. First, there were excellent presentations, but I find that we're trying to talk, it isn't quite certain to me of what we're speaking. Are we speaking about the future of Soviet Jewry? It's a very important topic. Tzvi raises for us questions, and Goethe does. If we're to go into that deeply in and of itself, how does one impact upon the future of the Soviet Jewish community? First of all, we aren't the ones to be speaking about it. I'd like to hear more from Parizhsky. I want to hear from people that are there. I want to hear what they have to say. I know what I have to say. I want to hear what they have to say. The whole question of trying to rebuild something not from scratch, he's absolutely right, taking a post-Tsarist in its Soviet transmigration to its post-Soviet identification that our colleague, some of us knew Gene Wiener called this post-assimilationist frame, is a whole thing by itself. It's clear that the old categories, I never ask anybody in Russian. I've been there 170 times. I never ask them, was your mother Jewish? Because it doesn't make a difference. I kind of ask them like, No, I used to ask, are you from a Jewish family? Now I ask, are there Jews in your family? Or maybe, did you ever meet a Jew? Because I don't know what it means. So whatever they say is good enough for me. So the whole question of what components will make people feel, will ensure a future Soviet Jewish, that's one piece by itself. A second piece is what Goethe tells us about the nature of the Jewish schools. There are people here who have built Jewish schools. Do they make a difference in individual Jewish lives? Of course they do. Do they have the mass impact we'd like to have? Of course not. We don't know anything that's going to make a big difference. Is it academic Judaica? Is it going to be Aliyah? Is it going to be the schools? No, we're all kind of fumbling, and it's obvious why we're fumbling. And we shouldn't forget this. The thing collapsed in December of '91. We're going to look back, our children and grandchildren are going to look back and say, only a dozen or 15 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, people are already talking about the impact, the systemic impact. Who the hell knows? We're doing the best that we can in all kinds of ways. Even the kibbutz here, about do the Sochnut and the Joint and Chabad and the locals and the progressives and everybody else, do we conflict? Is there competition? If you accept the concept of kind of kinat sofrim, we're all trying to do the best job. It's one thing that's clear to me, I've been doing this for a long time, as some of us have. It's clear that there are wasted resources, that's for sure. If we were to sit together around seriously, and will the Chabadniks sit with us, or we sit with them, and the Sochnut, the Joint, and really say, who's going to do what? Who does what the best? How can we complement each other's efforts in producing some future model? I haven't been a part of that yet. Maybe that's what people are trying to achieve with Limud. I don't know myself. We're looking for new kinds of formats. And the question that Barry raises, which are really macro, the meta questions, what do we really expect from schools and the myths, and is the whole enterprise worldwide, I only say this here, I won't say this in public, is the whole thing, you get the feeling the whole thing is going down the tubes. And now the day schools, our job, we're going to put our fingers in the dikes and we're going to save. Will that make a difference? I don't know. So I find that depending upon which question we're asking, I have the right answer. But I don't quite know what question we're asking yet. I do very much appreciate the thoughtful, intellectual input of our colleagues, because each of us is trying to grapple with this. But I'll say for this group, I would say, okay, if we better define what the real questions were, then I can talk about what the real answers were. I'm not quite certain. I know, I intuit, and I'll conclude with this, it has something to do with what the Torah taught us. But which part of the Torah, and in what language, or what's the authentic speech and the authentic questions, is it something that many of us say every morning? Is it like Me'anachnu and Mechayenu or Mekochenu? Where are we going with all this? I sense that all of us are we're all doing the very, very best that we can in our own particularly small efforts. Good people all working together. But I think there's a macro or a meta vision or a meta piece that we just can't wrap our hands around. And until we somehow in the future get to that, we're all going to be doing our own things. Though I must say that the Midrash says when the Jews crossed the Red Sea, Yam Suf, I thought, according to Cecil B. DeMille, which you didn't see as a young person, which I did, they all went together. According to the Midrash, there were 12 separate streams. Every tribe went separately. Maybe that's how it has to be in the Jewish people.
The last impassioned 5 minutes was given by Jonathan Porath, who was a country director of St. Petersburg and the Volga region for the Joint. Any further questions or comments? Bevakasha.
I believe that if we can learn from others, maybe we can also advance ourselves. There are groups that might be a shanda that we even think of them. For instance, the Mormons, they have a draft. Every young Mormon spends at least 1 to 2 years as a soldier for the Mormon church. They do missionary works, and since they don't depend or they can't trust one, they always go in pairs, and they do fantastic work. They've converted many, many people. What I'm trying to say is that if Judaism becomes attractive enough for non-Jews, then maybe Jews will see that it's also attractive for them. When you get a non-Jew to come to Israel and you excite him or her, and they come back and they give speeches to Jewish audiences, then Israel becomes kosher and so forth. So it's maybe food for thought.
Okay, there is nothing to say, unless, Alex, you say it. Excuse me. I'll stop here for a moment. Oh, want to respond to... Okay, yes, but there was a hand up over here. Please.
Excuse me, my English. It's not my profession. I'm from Kazan, Russia, the director of the school. So, why we need these schools? A few years ago, nobody could imagine that young people, kids, will go in the bus and will say, I'm Jew. Never. But now they are proud of being Jews. No parents will send and will speak and will identify themselves as Jews. But now they do it. Our community consisted of only very grown-up people, if not, say, old people. Nowadays, we have a lot of youth, a lot of young people who come to the community, who help elderly people, who help young children. So community becomes stronger and stronger. So if we say, do we need these schools? Yes. Is there the future in these schools? Absolutely, yes. So I'm proud of being a director of such kind of school. And I would say thank you to all the people and to all organizations that help us. Because, of course, we can do a lot with our community and with businessmen who help us. But your help is great, of course. And I hope that in a few years, when our graduates will become business people, we will do without any help from abroad. So, but now we need your help. And our schools are very important indeed.
Speak.
If I may, I'd like to follow up on that voice from Tatarstan, which indeed is very exciting. The people who have helped Jewish education and Jewish life in general have been largely ethnic entrepreneurs, religious entrepreneurs from the outside. There was a beginning with the Russian Jewish Congress of a self-financing, self-sustaining Jewish institutional building. And for various political reasons, remember that Gusinsky was the president of the Russian Jewish Congress, and what fate befell him. That self-sustained growth stopped, or at least slowed. And I want to ask the following questions. Chabad, Sochnut, Reform movement, conservative movement, secular movement, all have agendas. They bring those agendas to the FSU and they say, here, build this kind of school, we'll help you. What kind of school do the people there want? It's a bizarre question. Now, initially one would think they can't answer that question. They don't know what a Jewish school is. That was true in 1991. It's now 2006. They've been at the Melton Center and God knows how many seminars all over Europe and elsewhere. They've got a pretty darn good idea of what's on offer. Do you think that Chabad is the most appropriate school for a largely secular population whose values include science, technology, work, I don't. But what I think is not important. What do the people on the ground think? And do any of the external agencies have it within themselves, rather than funding their ideologies and implementing their agendas, to say, we'll help you build whatever you want to build? Realistically, no. But it's an interesting question. Second point was made by people other than myself at this conference, and as I should say again, I'm glad that this particular Yovan fell into this particular sukkah, because as always happens when I go to conferences outside my field, I learn something, which is not always the case, and never mind. And that is, it occurred to me that perhaps, whereas in some countries synagogues and temples, or Jewish community centers, or fabulous athletic complexes such as we see in Central and Latin America are the centers of Jewish life, given the realities and the intellectual heritage of the people living in the former Soviet Union, maybe schools will be not the end point, not the outcome, not the products of communities, but the creators, as has been said many times, and as Barry said, and now I want to disagree with Barry.
Your time's up.
I thought his remarks were extremely perceptive and very thought-provoking, and I was with him all the way until the end. Because ultimately, in my reactionary way, believe me, I don't long for the kanchik, and I don't want the Rebbe to hit me on the hand with the ruler. But I have to say, as a student at the same college you went to many years after I hated seminars, and I loved lecture classes. I didn't want this touchy-feely crap. I didn't want to hear what my fellow student had to say. He was as damn ignorant as I was. I operated on the perhaps foolish assumption that the professor knew more. Shut up, kid. I want to hear what he has to say. Ultimately, I think the school has to be Kinder, setz euch weg und lernen Apostel Chumash mit Rashi. Or whatever the content of the school is. You want to read Achad Ha'am, Gesundheit. Whatever it is. Ultimately, the school is a school. It's not a therapeutic clinic. Now, maybe in order to get there, and I completely agree with this, you can't take a foreign body of language and throw it at kids. But if the kids do connect with each other and with their parents and ultimately with the larger community, that's not the end of the story, and I'm sure you didn't mean it to be. It's the first necessary and probably most logical step, but I'm in a hurry. I know a Hillel director who built his foundation on the idea of showing movies, which at that time when he built it were popular. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, to get kids in the building. I said, good. And after they're in the building, what are you going to do? Show them another movie. Okay, after they've seen 3 movies, what's the next step? And he had no answer. We've got to have an answer. Because I think we're starting to get there. We're starting to build not just schools, but communities. And now we have to start to think, not we, the people in the FSU. Not we. Maybe, okay, we can give an eitzah here or there. What does the word Soviet mean, after all? Sovietnik. Eitzah-geber. But they have to tell us what we want for our particular communities and our particular needs. And as Gerda said, yeah, 44 schools and they're all different. Nachon. And they should be. Thank you.
Just perhaps one last thought, impossible to summarize, other than I think on this. I returned yesterday morning from an umpteenth trip to Russia. In this case, it was from Moscow. And among the conversations that I had over there was with Professor Arkady Kovelman, who was here last week and who is head of Jewish Studies at Moscow State University. A very close colleague of Shimon Parizhsky, a close colleague of all of us. He was telling me about a program that Arkady and Shimon and Tanya and Gerda and a number of others were instrumental in setting up, in which high school students who are not at Jewish high schools, who are at elite high schools, spend a week of every year studying Jewish texts intensively. Talking about some hundreds of students. Indeed, some of them also go to a Sunday school in Moscow. Not hundreds, only 25. And I walked away saying to myself, just a minute, intensive week. This is a week's time, and 25 here and 100 there. And it felt to me all of a sudden that after 15 years, we're talking about we need a generation here. And in a conversation just a couple of hours ago with Shimon, he says the same thing again. We need a generation over here. And so I don't know, Gerda, that I would run into research all of a sudden. My sense is that some of us are going to wake up 10 years from now, 15 years from now. We should only live so long. And we will have discovered that the sea change has taken place. And indeed, there will be in Kazan and in Moscow and in Ekaterinburg and wherever else that there are yet Jewish communities, and there won't be in every place that we're working today. There will be many committed Jews, many knowledgeable Jews, many wealthy Jews, working toward their own Jewish future by their own definition of Jewish identity, and they are going to be part of a pillar of Jewish life that is going to be quite different from Israel's pillar, America's pillar, and we will all be involved in a dialogue about this international global people, which was once called the Elders of Zion. And I think at one point we will all be proud of to be able to say, yes, we are indeed global. And finally, there isn't a time that I come back from there, this Israeli, this former American, and there isn't a time that I don't come back with the sense of, my God, how did this happen? Because in our world where every day we're so involved in doing what we do, every once in a while the miracle of it gets lost. And by God or by something, this is a miracle. And perhaps acharon chaviv, I would say that in response to something that Beverly Gribbetts had said in an earlier session this morning in response to Shimon Parizhsky again, there is a world over here that many of us just haven't known about. I was fortunate enough to begin learning a year and a half ago, and hopefully will finish my career continuing to learn about it. But it is very worthwhile every once in a while to recognize that Israel and the diaspora includes more than the United States, intensively more than the United States. And many of us also forget that. And so I want to thank again Tzvi, Gerda, Barry, and really thank you for allowing me to be part of this. And acharon chaviv to Alex for making this session also possible. Toda rabah, and b'te'avon l'kulam. 6 o'clock.
All right, we're going to begin with your permission. Even without it, we're going. Okay. This is like, seems to me a little bit like Tfilat Arvit after Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, but b'chol zot.
What's that make me?
One of the most powerful images for me that will accompany me for a while that Deborah Myers spoke about in the opening session of this conference was this image of eating dinner with the family around the table, the dining room table. And that whole image for me is something that I cherish and I appreciate. I wish I could do more of that with my own children. And I think that everybody here shares that feeling of a sense of family, sense of community. And therefore, I think it's most appropriate that the final session today is really being devoted to changing conceptions of Jewish community in the United States, the implication for day schools. In other words, this very powerful image for me of what's happened to the Jewish family and to the Jewish community is one that I think was triggered by some of the remarks that Deborah made in our opening presentation. And I think that it's really accompanied us throughout this very exciting conference. And for that purpose, we've invited Professor Stephen Cohen, professor at the Melton Center for Jewish Education at the Hebrew University, as well as research professor of Jewish Social Studies at Jewish Policy at HUC in New York. You notice which one I got correct. We've asked Steve actually to share with us some of his insights into some of these changing conceptions in the American Jewish community. After Steve's presentation, we've invited Johnny Ariel, who's the executive director of NACI at Jaffe at the Jewish Agency for Israel, to respond to Steve's remarks. And therefore, it's with pleasure that I introduce Steve Cohen. Thank you.
Since this is a conference on community and colleagueship, schools, and so forth, and since I think I'm the last official speaker at this conference, so I get the pleasure of thanking Alex and all of your helpers. This was great. A great learning experience, and all of us saw a little piece of the work that Alex and his support staff did by the emails. Just realized they went out to all of us, and everything went back and forth. And I know I asked you a lot of your help, and not only did you give it, but you gave it very quickly, because I'm up all hours getting email, and apparently you are as well. So kol hakavod, and thank you for doing this for us. And thank you for inviting me to give a keynote address. That's so lovely. And I was trying to figure out what is a keynote paper and how is it different from a normal paper. So it's a little longer. And I was looking at various, and I listened, I read the keynote addresses, and is it seniority? And it's not maturity, I know that, but is it seniority? Is it speaking ability, having American accent, giving a synthetic approach rather than monographic? And I after listening to all the keynote papers, I finally figured out what qualifies as a keynote paper. It didn't occur in any of the individual papers, but it occurred in all of the keynote papers, and I will add to that. It's that you begin with a public declaration of your ignorance about Jewish education. This qualifies you to give a keynote address, and even after many years at the Melton Center for Jewish Education, used to be in the diaspora, they dropped that. So I will begin with my declaration of my genuine lack of scholarly familiarity with Jewish day schools, except for the two questions of who goes there and what happens to them afterwards. There's a whole other area of what happens to them while they're there that you're all much more expert in than I am. And so this dual title about what's happening in the American Jewish community and what's implications with day schools, you will see that I will devote much more attention to the first part of that title than to the last part. And I will count on you to fill in, and Johnny to fill in much of the last part. Johnny, actually, you're substituting for Ami Bouganim. But I will make the concession. I will go back to English. So what I want to look at today are, in light of the changing patterns of Jewish identities and communities, notice I use a plural, in the United States, what are the challenges to building Jewish connections and communities in the United States? How, in fact, are day schools responding to those challenges, how can they, maybe even how should they, and specifically as the models of Jewish communities change, how can, do, and should J schools adapt to those changes? To speak to that issue, I'll be drawing upon essentially two bodies of research. One is published and familiar to, I hope, many of you, and the other less so. Just recently, as some of my work's been coming out. The work that I will be drawing upon at the very beginning of my presentation is the work that I did with my good friend Arnie Eisen, a book called The Jew Within, published in the year 2000, based upon research we did in the 1990s that probably should have been written in the 1980s, but we got to it late. And the other is work that I'm doing now primarily with Ari Kelman, who's going to be at UC Davis. And we looked at Jewish identity models of connection among younger adult American Jews, which means primarily Jews 25 to 35 years old, who are, on one hand, a harbinger of change, and on the other hand, are reflecting family life cycle effects that will dissipate as they get older and have children. I said that one of the keys to becoming affiliated with the organized Jewish community is to give birth to a 7-year-old child, and before that happens, that people are highly unengaged in Jewish life. When that happens, there's widespread engagement, provided you're also married to a Jewish person. So let me try to quickly summarize the earlier work and then move on to the later work and see what it tells us about the changing shape of community. And then I obviously eventually move on to the challenges to the community and how day schools can, should, and do respond to those challenges. The challenges to Jewish community really fall into two large categories: the structural and the cultural. For years I have been mystified by, annoyed by, frustrated by the failure to attend to the social structural aspect of being Jewish on the part of both analysts and the part of Jewish educators. By structural, I mean the connections that Jews have to one another. And in this area, we find declines in almost all measures of association and formal affiliation among Jews. There's what I call the ethnic scaffolding. It starts with marriage and proceeds upward or outward to less intimate relationships. But one of the master themes of Jewish life today, and it's one that really that affects everything else that we do, is that fewer Jews are married to other Jews. Fewer Jews have Jewish friends. Fewer Jews have Jewish neighbors. Fewer Jews have Jewish coworkers. Fewer Jews belong to Jewish organizations. Not all. I'm going to correct that in a second. Fewer Jews have a strong attachment to Israel. Fewer Jews have an attachment to the Jewish people. How do we know? They say so. We ask them questions. How attached are you to the Jewish people? Do you belong to Jewish people? Do you care about Israel? And as you look at the evidence from then till now, from old to young, you see declines in all these attitudinal measures as well as declines in these behavioral measures. For further elaboration, look at the article that Jack Weinheimer and I wrote in this month's Commentary magazine, which is online, about called Whatever Happened to the Jewish People. Now, having said all this, there are some areas of either stability or, frankly, growth. Institutionally, there are two areas of stability. One is the synagogue. There is no decline in the number or proportion of Jews who are affiliated with synagogues. And there's also no decline in the number of Jews who are members of JCCs, Jewish Community Centers. Those two phenomena, those two pieces of data, point to broader phenomena. One is that there is, in general, religious stability among U.S. Jewry. That is, the indicators of religious affiliation, religious engagement, religious involvement are all pretty much flat and steady. So belief in God, going to synagogue, lighting Shabbat candles. You know, years ago, Wolf Kelman said there's more kashrut, but less kashrut, but more glatt. I can now tell you that there's change neither in kashrut nor in glatt, where that these indicators are continuing to hold steady, and this despite the significant rise in intermarriage, which erodes this behavior, which means that the in-married population today is relatively more religious than the in-married population of yesteryear. There's a selection factor going on, and they're pulling up the national Jewish religious averages. In fact, in one area, I think it's fair to say more Jews are formally Jewishly educated than before, than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly. Younger Jews are more educated than older Jews. Jewish youngsters are more educated than Jewish parents. Jews today are more educated than Jews 20 years ago, on just almost all measures. We don't have good numbers on preschools. We think they're up. If someone does, I'd love to hear about the study of Jewish preschool enrollment then and now. We think they're increasing. In the area of elementary Jewish school education, there's been a shift to the wings. More Jews getting no Jewish education, and many, many more Jews getting Jewish day school education, with decline in the middle. By the way, the movement to the wings and decline in the middle is one of the master themes of the evolution of Jews in America today. When I was, for people my age who were raised Orthodox, under half of us went to yeshivas or day schools, and when last I checked, 94% of Orthodox youngsters are attending yeshiva, or have attended yeshiva day school. For the conservative movement, it's gone, in one generation, it's gone from 10 or 11% to 26%. Reform movement, only 4%. Footnote, the Reform and conservative Jews are still very, very different Jews. Many people who I've recently been meeting in my wandering around HUC-JAR claim that Reform and conservative Jews are just a little bit different, and maybe conservative movement ought to close up shop and fold its tents and join with Reform and becoming this kind of big tent of progressive Judaism. I say to them, first of all, I think it's bad for the Jews. It's only bad for the conservative movement, but it doesn't reflect the reality on the ground, where you have very, very different populations. Let's get back to current issues. So there's a sharp increase in Jewish studies at the university level. Something like over 40% of American Jews under the age of 35 have taken a class in some aspect of Jewish studies. It was where I personally received most of my formal Jewish education. Was at Columbia University. Not much before, not much afterwards, but that's where it happened, and that's where it happens for a lot of American Jews. The university and Jewish studies at the university has not entered into the consciousness of the community. Sorry, to myself, or to Jewish educators as a major source, a major locus of Jewish education. So when we think of Jewish educators, is Tzvi here? Tzvi Gilman, as an example. Tzvi Gilman, like I think he may have said yesterday, he's not a Jewish educator, but he is a Jewish educator. He's one of the leading Jewish educators in America today, as is the other 1,500 members, as am I, many of us in this room, in the Association for Jewish Studies. And then adult Jewish education has grown enormously. I don't know if is Mervis in the room? You should be. Tell Mervis I congratulated him on leading one of the greatest experiments, the greatest innovations in Jewish education, which is, of course, at the Melton, Florence Melton Adult Mini School, and other such experiments around the world. Know ye that that just as an example of the increase in adult Jewish education, take the simple use of the word text. I know the Melton, the Sam Melton Center for Jewish Education taught me the word text. It was Michael Rosenak in 1985 at a conference right here. Actually, it was in the library, when Michael Rosenak used the word text. And I said something like, "What's that?" Or, isn't William Safire text? And he said, no. He taught me the word text in public. It was a very nice thing. And then I mentioned this a few weeks ago at the Network for Research in Jewish Education, and Barry Holtz says to me afterwards, he said, "You're right. Like it wasn't just my personal ignorance of the word text in 1985. It was Barry Holtz reports that in 1984, when he puts out Back to the Sources, he has an argument with his publisher, an American publisher, who says the public will not understand the word text. They'll think it means textbooks. He goes, no, it's got to say text. And he was already, kind of in the avant-garde. So I'm just pointing to that maybe memorable moment, which I now have confirmed for me, that starting in the 1980s, it's only in the 80s, Melton, the mini school gets founded in 86, that we see an emphasis on the word, that we see the word text move into our lexicon. If you speak to 20-year-olds today who are Jewishly involved, and you say that text is an invented, recent Jewish word, they look at you with great, with open eyes, and they can't believe it. But it is true. I'm pointing to all this to point to the growth in this form of Jewish education. So you put all this together, and what you have is, I believe, a shift towards individual service to the religious sphere, away from the ethnic sphere. We could argue about the word ethnicity, but certainly, having said all this, there is a major challenge to Jewish community building when Jews don't link up with each other, when they don't just know each other, and that is well embodied in the fact that of Jews a little older than me, 2/3 of them have mostly Jewish friends. Of Jews about 15, 20 years my junior, only 1/3 have mostly Jewish friends. To appreciate the importance of social structure, or call it social tissue, social capital, any of those things, I want to just give a few examples to drive home this point, because, as I say, I've been frustrated all my life that people seem not to understand how critical social structure is. Let's look at the impact of mixed marriage. Many people think that mixed married Jews are less active in Jewish life because they had a weaker Jewish education and they come from, parental homes that are not so Jewishly engaged. That's partially true. But the independent statistical effect of mixed marriage on the Jewish future is phenomenal. You take two people with equal levels of Jewish socialization and education, one intermarries and one inmarries, the chances that one will raise a Jewish child are different on the order of 50 to 60 percentage points. They are huge. And once you don't raise a Jewish child, if that's not part of your life, the chances of your being engaged in Jewish life are far lower, which is a point I'll get to. Secondly, I've often quipped, but I'll unquip, and say that the Jewish density of residential zip code is more predictive of in-marriage than is Jewish education. Right? There's some Lenny Bruce line which we could adapt here about, if you're uneducated in Brooklyn, you're more likely to marry a Jew than if you're educated but in Sioux City. That's really what I'm trying to say, that there's a major difference in intermarriage rates by zip code, by region, and so forth and so on. Third, Robert Putnam points out that when you live in a home with more people, you're more civically engaged. One of the strongest predictors of Jewish involvement is how many Jews live in your house. None, get off the survey. But all right, one, you and no one else. You live alone, or you have, you're intermarried. Two, you and perhaps a spouse, or you're a single mother. Three, you, a spouse, a child. Four, you, a spouse, 2 Jewish children, 3 Jewish children. And if you imagine just running the crosstabs and looking at all measures of Jewish education, those numbers go up and up and up, in part because of factors coming in, but in part because of the independent impact of having family members who are Jewish, who have Jewish needs and associations. Ergo, the Jewish community. Jewish educators, Jewish day schools have a strong interest in promoting family formation that fosters Jews living together with other Jews. Last, Jewish friends. It turns out that the number of Jewish friends you have is even more predictive of Jewish engagement than intermarriage. One of my anti-intermarriage buddies said to me, "You can't write that." I said, "Well, it's true. It's true. The Jewish friendship is a major predictor of Jewish involvement. I once was asked to give I often get asked to give talks to places, things that I know nothing about. This occasion was to talk about how California Jews are different from Jews in the East. I was in California, so. And I racked my brain, and I finally came up with a paper which was basically, why are California Jews less Jewish? And the answer was, they have fewer Jewish friends. And if the few Californian Jews who have only Jewish friends are as active in Jewish life as the many Eastern Jews who have many Jewish friends, and, you know, contrapositively, I'm sorry, I don't have the word to give you, the opposite, you know, that the few Eastern Jews who have no Jewish friends are just as unengaged in Jewish life as the many Californian Jews who have no Jewish friends. So Woody Allen had something right. So if I haven't made this explicitly clear, Jewish education has always responded willy-nilly. If it hasn't, then there's an extinction function. But Jewish education responds to the needs of the day. And I'm telling you, the needs of this day are to build Jewish association and Jewish affiliation. And Jewish education ought to recognize the production of Jewish association, friendship, and all that other stuff, in marriage, yes, in marriage, as essential to Jewish education. I was taught once there's some Talmudic expression, "Ein kemach, ein Torah." Is that right? Did I get that right? So, you know, im ein Jewish social capital, ein Jewish identity. All right, so just hold that. It's mellifluous, I know, but yeah, I'll help you remember it anyway. Next, moving on from structure to culture. And here I want to talk about the two generations I spoke about. One is my generation that Arnie and I investigated, and the other is Ari Kelman's generation that he and I investigated. So let me tell you about the generation that Arnie and I investigated, really very, very quickly. We wrote a book which posited the supremacy or primacy of what we call what?
How old are you? We need to know how old you are. You're losing us. Sorry. I had the exact same question.
I was born in 1950 under a purple moon. I was born in 1950. I don't know. Does that help? Yeah. All right. Well, I guess. Thank you for that. Unless you thought I was older. Anyway, right. I'm a baby boom generation. Vietnam, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing. The culture of the sovereign self. We pointed to 6 critical points which kind of explain the culture, what we call the culture of the Jewish sovereign self, the assertion of the self as primary to Jewish identity, the Elohim. The inalienability of being Jewish. People were saying to us, we were struck by this, that no matter what I do, what I don't do, I'm still Jewish. You can't take that away from me, to quote a song. Now, that sounds wonderful. It sounds much better than the 19th century when Jews stopped being Jewish. But today you can do anything you want and still remain Jewish, and people fiercely attach themselves to being Jewish. I wouldn't call it the downside, but the consequence of that is that there is no shame, embarrassment, sanctions. You know, you can't take away a person's Jewishness anymore. They have nothing to lose, and they can define who they are no matter what they do. 2, related to that, is voluntarism, the assertion of free choice. I have the right, and as we'll see, I have the obligation to choose how, when, where I'm going to enact my Jewishness. It has to be a matter of choice. One of the most frequently used expressions in American Jewry today is that we are all Jews by choice, which is a way of being inclusive of converts to Judaism, but it also reflects the strong element of choice that's existing throughout the culture. A third, the notion of autonomy, which as opposed to heteronomy. And we have people saying, I need to feel like it's coming from the inside. Yom Kippur is a very personal holiday. If you don't feel it, it's hard to do it. You know, this is emes. I mean, this is exactly what we heard from people. Personalism, which is a word that Charles Liebman, my teacher, who I so much loved and appreciated and learned so much from, invented. And that is personalism is the ideology or the nitiyah, the intention to make personal meaning the arbiter of Jewish involvement. And if I find it meaningful, I'll do it. If not, I don't have to. I don't want to, and you can't make me. Anti-judgmentalism related to this. Whatever I do or I don't do, you can't judge me. I learned this word in 1996. I know exactly when it happened. I was a young man writing for Shema magazine, accused me of being judgmental when it comes to intermarriage. And I didn't know what the term meant. So I went to a young lady at Parizhsky, and I asked her, because I figured it's a new word. And she said, "You want to know?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "It's not good." So I said, "No, give it to me." And then she explains it's judgmental, you're being exclusive, and so on and so on. So, and I said, well, I thought Judaism was all about judging. And it turns out that that's not the case. There's a strong anti-judgmentalist bias, which relates to our sixth point. And this is a word I just invented for today. So, I want to give you something new, even with this little part of the talk that you've all heard before. And it's called journeyism. And it appears in the same dictionary that you'll find personalism, which means it doesn't appear in the dictionary. Journeyism is the sense that we're all on personal journeys. It's very Protestant. I'm better today than I was yesterday, and I'll be better tomorrow than I am today. And I expect the world to support me on my journey. By the way, all these issues, I've heard several of your papers here. People who do know about Jewish education in day schools, I've heard many of you giving papers that reflect these tendencies. There's an educational philosophy that reflects a lot of this and respects individual journeys, as well as anti-judgmentalism, personalism, autonomy, voluntarism, and perhaps even inalienability of being Jewish. So that's where we leave off, is in the year 2000. And now we go out and we look again. This time I'm now traveling with my friend and colleague Ari Kelman. And what do we find? We find that all these trends I mentioned continue in the younger generation, with some buts. And the buts, since I really do work hard in communication, I invented a way for you to remember the next part of my talk. It's A, B, C, D. Got it? What do you think about the organized Jewish community, the OJC? Well, leave that a second. What do you think? I think A, B, C, D. What is A? A for alienated, B for bland and boring, C for coercive, and D for divisive. Let's go back over each one of these. This is much harder to take when you're sitting in America. All of you Israelis have this, this dual reaction now. You're like, oh, that's why I made Aliyah. But for the Americans, there's nothing sweet about what I'm saying right now. So I deliver it in a little different style. But I'm in Yerushalayim. I'm, Liyot Am Chavchi B'Yatzenu. Okay. Alien. It's not mine. This Jewish community you have, it's not mine. It's somebody else's. It's impersonal. It's meaningless to me. I don't get it. It's bland and boring. It's all the same. It's too uniform, unexciting, routine. With these eyes, you see things. I was speaking in a conservative synagogue in a major metropolitan Midwest place, and I looked at it was the Sunday. It was the third talk, and they had the real balabatim sitting around, like 40 people. I looked at all of them and said, "Wow, you're all 53 to 57 upper middle class professionals who are conservative Jews, who are heterosexual and unmarried. Fascinating." And I said, don't you have an obligation to kind of reach out to, other people? And they kind of shake their heads. And the rabbi got up and said, "We at Temple, whatever the hell it was, we believe in change, but a change that is properly, focused and goes through halakha and the Mardatra and everything else." So it was a remarkable experience. But if you are not all those characteristics, you think this is bland and uniform. And that's the way a lot of American Jews, especially younger people, look at that, to say nothing of all the other deviants, quote unquote, or different deviants in sociology is actually could be a good thing, but people who are different, right? Coercive. They view the Jewish community as being normative, demanding, ideological, institutional, class hierarchical, conservative. Those are all, that's like judgmental. Those are bad. And just as an aside for us Israelis, and I have some bad news for us, the only time Israel came up in our work, in these interviews, was as an object of alienating coercion. I don't want to be involved with the organized Jewish community. I find it hard to, because if I go there, they're going to expect me to support policies I don't believe in. These are coming from people. I've been to Israel 5 times. I've been to some of the best Jewish, Hebrew University, Parizhsky, everybody sitting around here. Your students go back and say things like this. We have interviews with them. I know where they went to school. I know where they were, and they were saying this prior to disengagement. Prior to this occurs in early 2005. Things may have changed, but there's still that issue. And the last thing is about divisiveness. They are concerned about 4 levels of division. The division that separates Jews from Jews. They're very anti-denominational. Jews from non-Jews. The ghettoization. The notion of pure Jewish, there's Jewish culture and there's like everything else. That separation culturally. And space. That there's Jewish space and there's non-Jewish space. So, in light of all this, putting all this together, what do these people want? I'm not saying we should, do what they say, but let's just at least hear what they want. Instead of alienation, they want to feel they own they own their Jewishness. They are living in an age of sampling and assembling. The iPod is the symbol of that. I can pick any music I want, put it in any order I want. I can have it come random. That's the way I want my identity. I can make it up, and we can all make up our own combinations of identities. I want it to be mine. If I'm going to be involved in the community, I want it to be participatory. I want it to be democratic. I want it to be meaningful. And along the way, while they're claiming their Jewishness, they're using a lot of irony and put down and distancing from the established Jewishness in order to establish their own Jewishness. Heb magazine is representative of that phenomenon. It is from my point of view, a positive boundary marker that allows them to be Jewish inside that boundary and indicates some familiarity with being Jewish. I assure you that an Armenian American looking at Heb magazine wouldn't get what's so funny, except they're culturally aware. But you have to be Jewish to appreciate Heb magazine. Instead of being bland and boring, they place a premium on diversity. American Jews go nuts over diversity. I can assure you, I wrote an article in the Forward last week with Shaul Kellner about the lack of gender diversity in the JPPPI. And I have a meeting right after I finish this conversation with them to explain my position and find out what they can say. But diversity isn't Jewish People's Planning Policy Institute, right? They didn't get it that not only is there an issue of feminism, but American Jews insist strongly now on diversity as a right, but also because they want the exciting, the unexpected. And if you go to successful Jewish institutions, as part of this need to counter the bland, there's a strong emphasis on performance, on theatricality, on engagement, on all aspects of culture and performance and performance studies. I was doing work on culture, and I got a question: is this entertainment or is this education? And I said, what's the difference? Good education is entertaining. The appropriate entertainment can be educational, and a lot of Jewish education occurs in entertaining contexts. Next, instead of coercive, they want inspirational resonance rather than authoritative command. They believe in people rather than institutions. When you ask people, why do you go to these things? Because of the vibe, because of the people who are there. No one says because they have the right position on changing halakha. Like this is really not their issue. They want places to be accepting, non-judgmental. They want episodic engagement. that suits their personal needs and interests. They want a philosophy of a proactive, aspirational approach rather than a reactive defense approach. They value hope over fear. And lastly, the issue of divisiveness. They want to cross 4 porous boundaries. They want their Jewish, non-Jewish boundaries to be porous. They want to be able to go. They want to be able to include Jews and non-Jews, different types of Jews. They want cultural hybridity. It is no accident, dear comrades, that Matisyahu is as popular as he has become. There are others in his wake. They combine Jewish and Latin. Hip-hop Judios is such a case. The Balkan beatbox. There are all these cultural groups now, these music groups that are combining the Jewish with the non-Jewish. And this is something that day schools probably can't do, although they want to do Jewish and non-Jewish space. They're more likely to go to anything Jewish in the knitting factory than in any JCC or synagogue, and expect to have higher standards and a better time at the knitting factory or Webster Hall or Southpaw or any of the places in downtown New York below 14th Street rather than on the Upper East Side or Upper West Side. Let me just make a comment about the change in attitudes towards non-Jews. In my grandparents' generation, my grandparents pretty much only spoke Yiddish. They had very little contact with non-Jews. My parents had contact. Their friends before 5 p.m. might have been non-Jewish. The serious friends after 5 p.m. were Jewish. And whenever we talked about Jewish things, they would whisper, "Did you hear what he did on Shabbos?" You know, it was like all of a sudden, if it was about money or Jewish, we went to a whisper. We didn't talk about sex, but if we did, that would be whispered to. My generation, I'm sitting on a Amtrak train with Rabbi Stephen Shaw, some of you may know him. In between us is Charles Silverman, 1984, and we got 3 hours together, and Steve Shaw and I are having this great conversation about Jewish matters, talking over Charles Silverman so we could hear each other. We get off the train. Charles Silverman, author of A Certain People, how Jews have accommodated to America, and they're 20% of that, and 40% of that, and they run the banks and the politics and blah, blah, blah. He says, "I was so embarrassed. I know it's not my fault, but I felt very uncomfortable as sitting here with you two talking so loudly that everybody around you could hear about Jewish matters." Next generation, our Jewishness is ignited among non-Jews. We go to a salsa bar, and we see if it's not Jewish, we can make it Jewish. How do we make it Jewish? My 6 friends get out, we start dancing the hora. And all these Latin Americans, they join in with us, and they start dancing the hora too. They like showing off, displaying their Jewishness in non-Jewish context. This is a very different world from my grandmother, my parents, me, and now them. So what does this all mean for day schools? I promise you very little, and here it is. Day schools can perform a number of functions. They are certainly affiliatory. They bring Jews together in a variety of ways. That's a very, very good thing, as you heard me say. They can be highly participatory in the sense that they are institutions which, outside of certain places, but generally and certainly in the non-Orthodox world, they're institutions where students, parents, lay people, teachers can all be contributing to Jewish life. Zahavi, I remember you told me a story about Central European Jewish schools. That hierarchical world that you spoke about reflects Central Europe, and is so inappropriate in America. It would never fly. They would close down in a second. In an odd way, they're accepting and inclusive. It seems day schools, they can even be more accepting and inclusive than synagogues. Synagogues, right? I mean, think about it. Who they can bring in, and the populations, they can create diversity. They can allow for choice. The effective subject of choice. Where's Alex? Alex, so much of your work is about day school choice and how people align their choices of the day schools with their personal Jewish identity. They have a new term, but you'll help me here. what I call derivative boundaries. Since American Jews don't like boundaries that are based upon ascription, day schools offer boundaries that are based upon choosing a function, choosing education. They educate through inspiration rather than command, and they are non-greedy institutions. They don't say you have to live your Jewish life here. It's clear you have Jewish life outside of here. And last but not least, and there are many issues we've spoken about, and a number of your papers touch upon the various functions of day schools for community. But the one I think perhaps hasn't been mentioned, if you've mentioned it, then blessed are both of us. They're social laboratories for change. Day schools provide a chance to experiment with different forms of Jewish community. And I heard several papers talking about different types of communities that are happening in day schools. Those communities can become models, or are models, for other ways in which Jews can organize. So following Peter Berger, day schools offer a response to the potential implausibility of being Jewish. They offer, he says, this rhymes, and let's not close. There is in response to the implausibility of religion. Religion doesn't make sense. There are three options. The deductive option, to deduce, to bring down old truths and stick by them and resist culture. The reductive option, give in to the world around us, and Jews want this. They don't like Israel. Hell with Israel. God, we don't need it. Yeah, we can do it. That would be the reductive option. And then there's the inductive option, which is to invent new ways of being Jewish that are both authentic, in a sense deductive, and market-sensitive. Mission-driven, market-sensitive. Day schools offer the chance for the inductive option, and they follow William Safire's dictum of what he calls the option 3 option. Every bureaucrat gives his or her boss a policy sheet with 3 options. The first option, the second option, and option 3. And everybody should know that it's option 3 that the bureaucrat would like you to accept. On that note, I give you option 2.
So thank you, Howie and Steve. And I suspect, for those of you who are planning on hearing Ami Buganim at this time, I apologize, I won't be able to do what de Tocqueville did for commenting on America. Perhaps the best I can do is do a Boswell. I hope, in any sense, that we can at least bring a European perspective to bear on what we think is happening in the US. So that's what I'm going to try and do. My dad, who's a professor of social science, who defines himself as an unreconstructed logical positivist, taught me at a very early age that the plural of anecdote is not data. So while Steve can base what he does on data, I can't. All I can do is bring you some...
excuse me, the appearance of data.
All I can do is bring, I hope, a couple of insights from what I see going on. And it starts like this. Community in America, I'm not here yet talking about the Jews. It strikes me as both being present and being absent at one and the same time. It is just stunning to someone who comes from outside of that country to see the tremendous activity in a very vibrant third sector, civil society, whatever words you want to use to describe it, coupled at one and the same time with remarkable neglect. Remarkable neglect. They say that Jean-Paul Sartre was once sitting in a Paris cafe and revising the draft of Being and Nothingness. And he said to the waiter, "I'd like a cup of coffee with no cream." And the waiter replies, "I'm sorry, monsieur, but we're out of cream. How about having your coffee with no milk?" It is unbelievable to any conception of Jewish life from wherever it comes across the spectrum to look at a society which has 40-something million people without healthcare coverage. It is unbelievable. I mean, inconceivable for a Brit, inconceivable for an Israeli half of his life, and totally inconceivable as a human being. Second example, this much more recent and much more, in some senses, tragic. Hurricane Katrina. 9 months on, bunches of Jewish students go down in spring break to New Orleans to help with the rehabilitation effort, and there are still houses with bodies in them that have not yet been evacuated. Think hard about Jewish tradition and its commitments to healthcare, its commitments to burying the dead within a very period of time, and you look at this and say, scream out, shout from the rooftops. So when any comment about community in America has to somehow be seen in this wider context of what I would call, on the one hand, incredibly present being, on the other hand, nothingness. One of the people that can help us understand part of what I think is going on, and I think Steve's bringing the evidence that he brought only highlights this for me. Zygmunt Bauman, the eminent sociologist, Warsaw, a couple of years in Israel and then in the UK, talks about community as being caught in the tension between freedom on the one hand and security on the other. We all want and treasure freedom, particularly in America. Rugged individualism, the foundational narrative of America, the Statue of Liberty, and all that goes with that. The ultimate freedom, of course, is the freedom to be different, to not play by the rules. And there was plenty of evidence in what was we've just heard to give us support for that in the younger Jewish community. But we all know too that what community can provide us, if it's smart, is security. Some sense of being able to look forward and not only look over your shoulder. There isn't a great deal of freedom as it so appears if you constantly have to look over your shoulder to watch your back. And the only way you will be able to do that is if you have some kind of agreement as to what the rules of the game are. Some solid bed upon which to lie your head at night. Therefore, for any kind of Jewish school effort, it seems to me, there have to be three kinds of claim of community that are there. And I don't think I'm particularly being new here. I'm just reflecting back on what I see and hear. Because community only means something, it seems to me, if not only will you do something for me when it's convenient for you, you will do it for me when it is inconvenient for you, and vice versa. Otherwise, it's very hard to actually grasp what is the kind of claim that would make human interaction and human empathy vibrant and be able to be played out. And in many senses, the wriggle that Steve's ably presenting to us, Steve and Arnie particularly presenting to us, over people wriggling over words like you ought to, you must, you should. I'm not too sure, I'm not convinced in my own sense, that you really can have senses, vibrant senses of community, without some orientation towards you ought, you should, you must. In whatever way that has to be redefined, and that's not presuming the kinds of community structures that could embed those kinds of commitments in this world that we have. But it strikes me that there's these three kinds of a claim that any Jewish school is going to have to wrestle with, and trying to figure out a balance between these is a very difficult, demanding challenge. One kind of claim is the covenantal claim. We are part of an authoritative Jewish tradition, God commanded in some way, with norms and values and expectations and practices, that we have to figure out the way in which we're going to live by those rules. Second is the solidarity community claim. In a sense, we're part of a wider group of Jews, in whichever country it is, and I would hope worldwide too. And thirdly is the cosmopolitan community claim, that we're actually part of the universe, we're part of humanity in general. there is inevitably tension between all three of those. Those pieces do not fit together easily. Even if you've got a particular way of understanding the covenantal community, it still doesn't mean that the cosmopolitan community claim, which is by definition, it seems to me, undermining in some senses, not all senses, but in some senses, of the covenantal claim or the solidarity community claim, that those pieces do not fit together. What I'm urging is that for a Jewish school to stand a chance of meeting the challenges that Steve lays out for us, is that you need these three as inescapable horizons for the school in the community. In the 1950s, some bright person was already beginning to track this, and I can't remember the name of the person, and I can't remember the year, because I only thought about it as you were talking. Someone coined the phrase a community of limited liability. That it's clear from the demands of modernity and the Enlightenment and freedom and the Statue of Liberty, we will never be able to have, if it ever did exist, but let's assume for 1 second it did exist, the fully engaged community, fully committed community of the past. The best we can get to is a limited liability community where I can claim things on you and you can claim things on me, but of a limited kind. Have the boundaries of those limits changed? Well, the evidence seems to imply, yes, they have. Does that mean we can do community without some kind of limit? I'm not at all sure. What would be viable liability is part of what we have to address. And perhaps the last comment. Do we get the schools we deserve? You know that very famous sort of argument? All schools are is basically a reflection of the society we have, the Jewish community we have in this sense. Or, are schools ahead of the game, behind the game, reflective of the game? What's actually going on with that? And here I want to urge us, and I hope that the next book but one will not highlight the sovereign self, but will actively go out to change the way we talk about things and capture that bit of human beings' lives, which is the social self, not the sovereign self. To figure out and treasure and highlight and spotlight those places where we do interact with others, we do engage with others, we do treasure that empathy, that company of critics, the company of adults, all those things, in order to highlight those as being perhaps more treasured norms and values to help us move forward. So schools we deserve. When I first became an educator, a madrich at age 16. So my mum proudly gave me a copy inscribed of the book by Neil Postman and Charles Weingarten, Teaching as a Subversive Activity. So I read this is fantastic. This is the mandate to be totally countercultural. And if you're hearing what I'm saying, yes, I'm urging us to be totally countercultural to the prevailing trends that are being laid out here, but hopefully in a smart way. The danger is that, of course, you risk parental support. You risk communal support, because you're going to have to undermine the socio-economic models in many ways to enable these kinds of values that I've been hinting at to take root. It took many more years before she had the courage, when she saw my enthusiasm, to give me the next book that they wrote called Teaching as a Conserving Activity, which of course makes the inverse kind of an argument for a reliable anchor, and that you know that you can predict that something will be there on the basis of what was. Of course, the conserving argument, as been made plain today and in other things that have been written, you end up being irrelevant. And it might well be that much of what we know of in Jewish community at this point in time is just irrelevant to the place where people are. To conclude, I want to suggest that schools have to be 1 step ahead, not 4 steps ahead. They can be one of those frameworks, and there aren't many that we have, that we know of. It can be one of those frameworks that can be 1 step ahead of the community. There's always that argument in the peace camp in Israel, particularly within Gush Shalom, Shalom Achshav, etc., etc. Should they be 3 steps ahead of the game or 1 step ahead of the game? They knew they had to be 1 step ahead of the game, otherwise they'd lose everyone. Right? So I don't know whether it's appropriate to draw that analogy, but it strikes me that schools have to be one step ahead of the game in being both countercultural and conserving. One of the ways to do that, one of the most profound influences on my life is the Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye in his book, The Educated Imagination. I just pulled it out of the shelf this morning when I was thinking about what he was going to say. And he's got a little piece in The Educated Imagination which goes like this. The society he does live in is identical with the one he wants to live in. So all he has to do is adjust to that society to see how it works and find opportunities for getting ahead in it. Nothing wrong with that. It's what we all do. But it's not all of what we all do. He's beginning to realize that if he recognizes no other society except the one around him, he can never be anything more than a parasite on that society. And no mentally healthy man wants to be a parasite. He wants to feel he has some function, something to contribute to the world, something that will make the world poorer if he weren't in it. But as soon as that notion dawns in the mind, the world we live in and the world we want to live in become different worlds. One is around us, and the other is a vision inside our minds, born and fostered by the imagination, yet real enough for us to try to make the world we see conform into its shape. This second world is the world we want to live in, but the word want is now appealing to something impersonal and unselfish in us. The impersonal and the unselfish will be the basis of any community that's worth building. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we were treated to two very rich presentations, and we have about 8 or 9 minutes for questions, comments. Please.
A lot has been said about how to get the day school system to go forward, how to try to fight the problem of assimilation, which many people say, well, it's not so bad after all. As we heard, things are much better than it should be. Just in a second to show what the situation really is as far as Jews are concerned, there was a handbook published by the American Department of Immigration covering the years 1850 to 1950, where the countries where people immigrated, or the ethnic groups. And I concentrated on a few. Among them, the Irish. 5 million Irish came to America during that period of time, and 5.5 million Jews. Today, the Irish claim that there's between 30 and 35 million Americans with Irish blood or Irish extraction. And if the Jewish population was 5 million, or 5.5 million in 1939, today it hovers, including half-Jews or not halakhic Jews, also about 5 million, including the fact that since 1950, since that survey was completed, maybe close to 2 million Jews have entered the United States. 750,000 from Israel, 800,000 from the Soviet Union, and the rest from North Africa, from South America, and Western Europe, and so forth. And so the situation is really very, very drastic. Something has to be done. I think one way is to have more of a holistic approach to involve different aspects, not only of the community, but also to go out of the community. For instance, there are...
Yeah, we're just very limited in time. So do you want to focus? Just try and brief as possible.
One suggestion. Recently, the Ohio Department of Agriculture, in cooperation with Israel groups and American Jewish group, invited a group of Ohioan farmers to visit Israel. They came back overly impressed. They had such fixed...
Okay, but do you want to formulate a question?
Okay.
There are other people who'd like to speak.
If there are groups, non-Jewish groups, that would be invited to schools, and if they would say how wonderful Judaism and how wonderful Israel is, I think it would really build up the self-confidence And self-esteem of Jews, I think it would be a very, very helpful thing.
Okay, I have a quick response. First of all, your numbers about the Irish Americans are wrong. The Irish are the third largest ethnic group in America that arrived here throughout the 19th century. Secondly, there is not a major problem with Jewish pride that they need to have their pride validated by American society. That is thinking that probably applied through the 50s and 60s, but there is not a significant element in the Jewish population that feels the need for validation. There is some gratitude that occurs, some appreciation, when Jews are validated in the public sphere. I don't want to say there's none, but the need is nowhere near as great as it was in the 1940s and 50s and maybe even the 60s. So that shifted considerably.
Danny? Steve, I wonder if you can comment on the unique place of the day school, given the description that you gave us, in being able to provide social capital to young Jews relative to their American culture through a Jewish institution. Meaning there are very few Jewish institutions in which a person actually gains status and enters into the bigger American culture vis-a-vis a Jewish institution. And as a day school principal, one of the burdens I have, actually, as a Jewish educator, is to help my students and the families actually gain entrance into elite sectors of American society. And I'm wondering if people are studying what does it mean for a young person to sense that it's actually this particular Jewish institution with its Jewish values that is giving it something powerful and unique as it enters into that broader American framework. And there are very few camps, synagogues, federations don't do that. And I'm wondering if there's something that can be capitalized.
The whole question of the Jews and elite status is a one, cuts a lot of different ways. Just to give you some examples, there are Jews who are more educated and wealthier are significantly more active in Jewish life than their counterparts. Part of the reason that the Jewish community has now shifted, now for a long time has shifted, to being the most highly educated, the most affluent community, significant religious ethnic community, not only in Jewish history but in the world. And so therefore Jews who fail to achieve those high levels of socioeconomic status actually feel that they are excluded from the Jewish community, and there are higher rates of intermarriage among low socioeconomically performing men, just to give you an example. On the other hand, Jewish schools have the unique or the distinctive need to demonstrate being able to channel the youngsters to high levels, to high socioeconomic levels of achievement, because they are suspect of being ghettoizing institutions that also contribute to that do not provide a quality education. So all you day schools need to perform and need to advertise in various ways. You do this, your performance in getting kids into these higher levels. And I would point out, I think your school is somewhere in the Boston area. Of all American Jewries, Boston is the most conscious of educational achievement as a sign of social status. The narrative of Washington is a narrative of power. The narrative of New York Jewry is a narrative of money. And when you go to Boston, what they tell you is, here we have 16 Jewish Nobel Prize winners, and the rest is commentary. So, you of all schools, you are the school of schools that has to emphasize educational achievement on the part of your graduates in order to be compatible and competitive in the culture in which you reside.
Right, but I'm not. That's true as a descriptive fact. What I'm trying to say is, what does it mean for people to develop their identities as Jews within institutions that they're choosing because of what it provides for them as leverage into the larger society? I have people coming to my school who are choosing it because it's going to actually enable them better in a more powerful way to enter into this? And what does it mean for them to identify their Jewish institutions with that leverage?
It cuts both ways. It brings people, also the non-competitive types who want a gooey, supportive, school for my kid, no matter how he or she may develop, may not like your school, they need another type of school, so it cuts both ways.
We have time for one more question. I saw Scott Goldring in the back. I think that this will be the final question.
You started with the notion that there are communities plural. I was wondering if you could speak to the fact that perhaps how your findings relate to the data we have that suggests that since there's so many day schools within North America, the majority of them are Orthodox of various types, whether or not you're suggesting that the people to whom the Orthodox market their schools are also reporting the same type of information, or whether or not your data is really speaking to only one smaller constituency of Jews who would be going and attending day schools.
Not knowing much about the Orthodox. I have a co-author and friend, Sam Heilman, who knows a lot more than I do. He's here now. I won't speak to the Orthodox except to use the usual Columbia College BS that we learned that allowed us to get a B+ on any exam, whether we studied or not. And that is to say that, for sure, two things. The Orthodox are very different, but the trends that I articulated probably have some impact upon the Orthodox as well. So that's the best answer that I can give. That would probably fill up the blue book.
Very, very interesting and no less important, fun experience. Thank you very, very much. And I'd also like to thank the Conference Steering Committee, because this is a group of people who invested no small amount of time and energy at different hours around the globe to really pull this together. And first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Alex Thompson, our newest member of the Melton Center for Jewish Education, Dr. Ami Buganim from the Education Department at Jaffe, Professor Steve Cohen, Rabbi Dr. Josh Elkin, Executive Director of Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education, Chaim Feder from the JDC, Professor Ellen Goldring from Vanderbilt University, Dr. Gabi Arenchik from the Melton Center, Bonnie Hausman from Peach, and Rabbi Asher Ostrin from the JDC. This has really been a wonderful experience. And finally, I just want to thank Stephen Markowitz. You can't miss him. But Stephen, together with Dina Klayman, have done an outstanding job at really making everyone here feel at home and as comfortable as possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, before you head for the doors, Howie said many of the things that I felt I should say myself personally, and then perhaps to give you a little bit more food for thought before you go, although I suspect many of you are now suffering from conference fatigue. I know I am. I will say some thanks first before we get to the thoughts. Certainly, many thanks to Dina and to Stephen, two outstanding individuals. All of you, I know, have had extensive contact with them by various technological media. They are really good-humored and generous individuals who there is no limit on how much time they've been prepared to give to this enterprise. It has been fun, and it's been extraordinarily productive, and maybe we'll do this again sometime, but not next year. Okay, so thank you, the two of you. Secondly, no less important, thank you to the staff of the Melton Center. The university advertises itself as a world-class institution, and indeed there are world-class people who work here. And at the Melton Center, Carmela, Carmen, Hinda, and Vivian are people who are always available any time of the day to offer or to intervene when help is needed. So many thanks to those people too. Howie's already mentioned the conference sponsors and partners. I will say a personal thanks to those people too, from the Jewish Agency, Ami Buganim in particular, from the Jewish Distribution Committee, the Joint. It has been a particular pleasure for me to renew a friendship with Chaim Feder that lapsed for about 20 years. That has been a particular treat. And with his boss, Asher Ostrin. The dynamic folks from Peach, wherever you are, Josh, Bonnie, and Suzanne, people always available, always ready to jump in, always ready with some wise words. So many, many thanks to you guys too. And last but not least, colleagues from the Melton Center, and I think Howie may have been somewhat unassuming here about his tireless contribution to this particular conference. Essentially, it began as a conversation in your office a couple of years ago. So many, many thanks to you in particular and all of the faculty at the Melton Center. Okay, so a few ideas for you to take on your way, or at least to take with you to the post-conference that I will give you some information about in a minute if you're planning to stay. This is the first conference I've organized in Israel, and it strikes me there's a linguistic issue here in that kenes and conference have different kinds of roots. The Hebrew word kenes derives from a word which essentially means to come together, to gather, to be in the same place as other people. Whereas the word conference derives from a word meaning to share ideas, to confer with other people. We could suggest, this seemed like a good idea at 2 o'clock this morning when I thought about it, we could suggest that this in fact is somewhat analogous to James Coleman's distinction between functional and value communities. That are those communities that are built on people coming together, on social connection, on people being in the same place and at the same time. And then there are those other communities that are built on ideas, value communities, he calls them. And in a sense, what we've tried to do here is create an environment in which both of those senses of the word, the kenes and the conference, have significance. It has been an opportunity for people to come together, and it has been an opportunity to share ideas. And it's quite possible that the most significant ideas you have developed are those ideas that you arrived at over coffee when somebody wasn't encouraging you to come up the stairs because you were already 5 minutes late for your session. It is possible also that those ideas are ideas that you encountered in sessions. And I will share with you 4 impressions of my own. Obviously, I wasn't in every session, but I can promise to have been in each keynote. And for me, I offer you 4 images that I am left with from those sessions. First of all, to Deborah's image of the staff room as a place that should be organized as a family dining room. That there should be just the one table large enough to accommodate all of the staff so that the kinds of conversations that emerge in that place are the kinds of conversations that are as intimate, as challenging, as provocative as the conversations that occur in our houses. I ask us, how many Jewish day schools operate in such a fashion? Secondly, Ellen Goldring's inspirational suggestion, which some found utopian, but I personally found that it resonated with evidence that I've encountered in my own research, and that is a kind of suggestion of intergenerational education. What would it be like for children to both learn and teach Hebrew? What would it be like if Hebrew wasn't something that was concentrated only within the walls of the school, but the resources invested in Hebrew teaching in schools were resources that were shared with the wider community? There's a very powerful, idealistic maybe, image of what community can do and what might be possible when resources are shared between schools and other institutions. I was struck by Zvi Gittelman's report of the cafe in Budapest, where the graduates of Lauder schools, not only of Budapest, but of the Lauder schools in Poland as well, somehow or another know when is the time and when is the place to gather. For me, in my own research, the question of what happens when people leave the school, is there an afterlife, a half-life of community, as it were, after you've left the radioactive Jewish institution? Well, in Hungary, it seems that maybe that is the case. And again, I ask, how many of us can imagine and can hope that Jewish day schools in other places in the world will still exercise the kind of pull that he suggested has been the case in Eastern Europe? And finally, Steve, I think, posed us all the challenge. How do you build a community with the iPod generation? This is something that resonates for me with a 16-year-old daughter who invariably is wired and very rarely listening. She's not listening to me. Maybe she's listening and communicating with her friends. Maybe while her iPod is on, she has found another way of communicating, and that is IM, on the computer keyboard, rather than by the more traditional means. But I ask us, again, I think Steve has identified some particular challenges. How do we build community when people are more interested in sampling what is best for them, particularly if it is only coming to them through their headphones? So, those were my images, and I suspect that each of you are left with images of your own. I know a number of you have asked us questions about the following matters, and I will try and address them here and now. What happens next? some people have said. Somebody terrifyingly said to me, is this going to be an annual event? Well, maybe once a decade we could kind of review this stuff. But next steps include, first of all, we commit to publishing a future volume in the near future, the relatively near future, of a volume of studies of Jewish education that will be, which will include the best from this conference. And if you presented a paper in this conference, you will shortly receive an email that will invite you to rework your paper. Not that it was a bad paper, but to rework it in the sense, rework it for publication. Prepare it for submission to publication. It will need to go through a review process, but we hope sooner rather than later to be able to publish a volume of studies in Jewish education that truly reflects the extraordinary richness of ideas that we've heard here. At the Melton Center, we have been giving some time to thinking about what do we do next? What can we do next to build on the interest and simply the quality of the participation that we've seen here. And there are a number of ideas that we have been working with and been sharing with foundations that we hope will involve many of you in the development of research in the field of Jewish day school education in the future. Again, sooner rather than later. To be able to facilitate that, it's unfortunate that Nava Frank was stuck between Boston and New York, but she would, I know, resonate with the notion of a community of practice. I think it would probably be too idealistic to imagine a community of practice emerging from this particular group, but I think it's reasonable to send you email addresses. We commit to sending you the email addresses of everybody who was here so that you will be able to continue communicating with them and with us, and so you will receive that soon. Finally, those of you who haven't had enough just yet and have already signed up for the post-conference, which is due to post-conference seminar, which is due to start at 3 o'clock, I believe. We ask you, if you are going to do so, to come down to the desk in the lobby where we will give you some instructions that will help you make your way to that post-conference session. And Stephen is mouthing me over there. One other final item that people have asked for is the opportunity to evaluate the conference. That is an ominous sign that people expect us to do this every year. But either way, your responses and your feedback will of course be useful, because Melton we will put on other events, even if they're not necessarily focused on Jewish day school education, even in the near future. So you will receive evaluation forms to that effect. And finally, let me thank all of you. Essentially, a conference is only good as good as the participants. And for me, this has really been a wonderful, wonderful event. The quality of the papers has really been stunningly, consistently high, and the volume of the conversation, perhaps fueled by the quality of the food and the wine, has been loud and engaging. And feel free to hang around. You don't feel that you need to be thrown out of the city or thrown off the university campus straight away. Thank you. Nasiya Tova.